All right, thank you. Good evening and welcome to the January 28th Bloomington Planning Commission meeting. The Planning Commission advises the City Council on development proposals, development standards, long-range planning, and transportation issues. Some of the items the Planning Commission has final decision authority, and others the City Council will make the final decision, as in our item tonight. Planning Commission is made up of 7 volunteers. Tonight, 5 of us are here, so we have a quorum, and each of us serves up to 3 years at a time. So tonight we have 1 regular item and 3 study items. We'll be taking public comment on the first item only. The others, as study items, are not subject to public comment. But before we start the meeting tonight, let's begin with the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. All right, Mr. Markegard, as we have for so many meetings before, do you want to provide information to the public out there for our first item tonight?
Sure. Mr. Chairman, Commissioners, we are again in a remote meeting setting due to the pandemic. This is actually our 19th remote meeting since the pandemic began. We do have one public hearing on the agenda tonight. It's item number 1. And even though most of the commissioners are remote and all of the applicants and public are remote, you can call in and testify for item number 1. And the number is on the screen. It's 1-888-742-5095. And then you would enter the conference code and you would be able to offer testimony. We'll have this number and conference code scrolling across the screen throughout item number 1. So just call in if you'd like to speak on that item. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Mr. Markegard. And I know as I look at our items tonight, our first one will be by Mr. Centenario. Commissioner Cookdon, did you have a comment?
Yes, Mr. Chair, I will be abstaining from this item to avoid a conflict of interest.
All right, thank you, Commissioner Cookdon. Mr. Centenario, we still have a quorum. Will you give us a staff report for the first item, please?
Yes, Mr. Chair. Good evening.
Good evening.
Can you hear me okay?
You sure can.
Okay, great. Thank you. So your one public hearing on the agenda tonight is a redevelopment proposal at 8131 34th Avenue. And this is within our South Loop district, along essentially where East Old Shakopee becomes 34th Avenue. And the proposal is for a revision to a long-standing preliminary development plan for Apple Tree Square. You've reviewed some other revisions to this with the American Square development more recently. And then also being proposed is a final development plan for a 146-unit age-restricted multifamily building. So I'm bringing up the original preliminary development plan from decades ago, and the parcel that, or the piece of land that we're going to be discussing tonight is outlined in red. And if you can see the other housing development that's not outlined, well, that's housing that was implemented. And the one in red obviously never materialized and was developed as a surface parking lot, which we'll show you more in a moment. And let me just make an adjustment here. I'm going to have to stop sharing for just a moment, and then I'll reshare. Sorry about that.
Nope, thank you. That's all right, Mr. Centenario.
Okay, there we go. Thank you. So here's an aerial image of this area. So this is a the oblique view, and you can see that housing development that was originally proposed that was developed, of course. And then here's the surface parking lot that's the subject of our proposal tonight. And so this is a piece of land along the Minnesota River Valley Bluff. And so there's a substantial slope just on the south and east portions of the site, which makes development more challenging, but then also provides an opportunity for some pretty spectacular views of the river valley. So it is a very appealing site for residential development, to be sure. But as you can see, that right off of the street, you have this parcel that's a surface parking lot, and then in this image you see the contours. So it really does drop off quite a bit. There's a very substantial retaining wall holding up that surface parking lot, and once you get beyond that, you're down the bluff towards the refuge land. So from the street, it looks fairly innocuous. It's a tiered parking lot. So along 34th Avenue, you have some parking, but then it slopes down, so you have additional parking that you can't see in this particular image. But the existing office building, which is not in this image, is served by a right out only as you exit the site, and that's something that the applicant and the fire marshal wants to change in order to create a right in, right out. So the Fire Station 3 at East Old Shakopee and East 86th Street would serve this development. So that right in off of 34th Avenue is critical to emergency operations, and we'll see that on a plan sheet momentarily. So here's an image of the site plan with the building that is out, is in that yellow color, and obviously you see the bluff along the east to southeast portion of the site, and the design team really tried to locate a building that maximized the slope exposure, but still was a developable building, and you can really see how the west portion of the building is hugged up against the public right-of-way. And that's something that takes its cue from our South Loop District Plan, which really advises to have a more urban character. And we see that in other development within the South Loop District. You certainly see that at across the street at Indigo and Fenley. And this would continue that urban character on this parcel. And of course, the South Loop District Plan also provides guidance on minimizing surface parking. And of course, this development would replace surface parking for a high density residential project. Just to give you a feel for kind of the change between the existing retaining wall and the proposed building, I added the location of the existing retaining wall in red, so you can kind of get a good feel for how this building would fit on this lot. So the design really tries to utilize the, I guess, filled area or the surface parking lot to the greatest extent possible. There are some small areas, especially in the south end of the site, that is not part of that surface parking lot area, but in large part they tried to use the existing area that's close to street level for their proposed building. And here's a close-up image of the main entrance. So this is the northwest corner of the building, and this is where you see that right out. That would become a right in, right out. So from this site, you would not be able to turn left to go south on 34th Avenue. There's a median there, but there is access from where my cursor is to the north, and then at Apple Tree Square, there's a private road that has a signal. So you can go, folks that are going southbound can turn into this development, and you can go south from Apple Tree Square. One of the elements that the applicant is proposing is a small right-of-way vacation that is in this blue shape. And so with the bluff being a very prominent geographic feature on this property, even though this blue area is only about 570 square feet, it allows would allow the building to be shifted slightly towards the public right of way, and that it makes it easier to build a building, but then it also has less impact on the slope. If you recall that just how steep that slope is, kind of straightening on the building towards the street reduces the bluff impact. So staff is supportive of that vacation. It is a separate application review process. But what is on the agenda tonight is for a preliminary and final plat, which would essentially combine that vacated right-of-way into the developable parcel. So on the left here, you see the preliminary plat, and obviously there's way too much information to really see what's going on there. But then here is just a snippet of the final plat. You can see that roughly 570 square foot area of proposed vacated right-of-way that would essentially just improve the developability of the proposed building. Here's a rendering of the building itself. So this is looking southeast. So essentially this is the most prominent corner of the building relative to the public realm, where you see that signage. That this is really at the main entrance where that right in, right out is. So as I mentioned earlier, a 6-story building. The materials palette is similar to what we've seen with other developments. Obviously, there's quite a bit of glass on the first level, which is a really attractive inclusion. A lot of your amenity spaces, the leasing office, fitness center will be along this glass area. And the other materials that are being proposed, of course, are the windows and then metal panels with fiber cement. So similar palette that we've seen, but like we like to see as staff, a lot of glass on the first level to at least provide some visual activation. And this is looking the other way, so you can see the 6 stories of residential levels, and then you have an amenity terrace with a pool. But then you also see the substantial exposed foundation, and that's for the structured parking. So this development would have 2 levels of structured parking beneath the 6 stories of residential floors. So with the landscaping plan, of course, with every development, we require a landscaping plan, and the applicant's plan meets the landscape quantity. We did get some feedback from residents about landscaping, and there were some questions about how how some trees, whether or not some mature trees were going to be removed, and how some additional landscaping could be accommodated, mainly between the proposed building and the existing condominium building. So that's something we are cognizant of, and spoken to the applicant, and I think we can make some improvements, which I'll point out shortly. But I wanted to also identify, this is a forested parcel, outside the parking lot along the bluff, and so there would be some mature trees that are removed, but if you can make out these light gray circles throughout this eastern portion of the site, those are all the mature trees that would be retained. So I think the applicant, while they do need to remove some trees to allow this construction to move forward, I think there are a substantial number of mature trees that would be retained with this project, which is good to see. Here's that area of the landscaping plan that I mentioned just briefly. This dashed red area, so that the existing condominium building is quite close to the property line between these 2 parcels, and so there's not much of a setback either on either side. But there are some coniferous trees that would be removed, and currently the landscaping plan isn't showing any screening or landscaping along this property line. And so obviously you have your drive lane that's going to lead down to the structured parking. So I think, we've spoken with the applicant, and there was some resident concern about improving the screening along this property line. And that's definitely something that we can accommodate. One other element of the landscaping plan that I wanted to mention is, again, you can get a better feel for the mature trees that would be retained. And then this area, this dashed or hatching area that it's kind of difficult to see, but there's a number of trees that they're proposing to plant along or within that bluff area. But this is an area that's actually currently part of that surface parking lot. And this hatched area is essentially area that they're reestablishing a bluff and then adding some trees. With any development with 20 or more units, we do have an affordability requirement. So there's a lot of text on the slide, but it relates to our Opportunity Housing Ordinance, or OHO. And the applicant is proposing to meet our OHO requirements. And in 9% of 146 is 13 and change. So we round up to 14 units. And they are proposing 14 units with a mix of 1 and 2 bedrooms. And so they are meeting that standard, and they're able to take advantage of the OHO incentives related to parking. They are seeking a deviation for parking, which I'll talk about in a moment. And then also the alternative materials. So on non-street side elevations, you're allowed some extra flexibility on the materials that could be used. And in this case, that's a fiber cement, a really common secondary material that's used in this context. So with parking, like a lot of development in our South Loop development or South Loop district, they are seeking a reduction in parking. Our parking code essentially is for freestanding independent uses. But when you have uses that are in close proximity and can share parking, we don't have an automatic reduction. And so depending on the amount of deviation that is being sought, we go through a parking study. And that's what was done in this case, where a third-party engineering firm did a parking analysis, and they found that the parking that's proposed, which is 285 stalls between the existing office building and the surface parking and the 2 levels of structured parking, is more than adequate. And the estimated peak demand is substantially less in the study concluded than the 285 stalls that are proposed. 65 of those stalls are intended to be shared. Certainly the existing office building would be selling this land for development, and a lot of surface parking would go away. So they are working out a deal to allow some shared parking, which is good to see. It just maximizes the use of stalls and fewer stalls that are sitting vacant throughout the day. But again, we're comfortable with the deviation that's being proposed based on the study's conclusion, and feel it's an acceptable level of reduction. So with that, we are recommending approval of the revision to the preliminary and final development plan, and then also recommending approval of the preliminary and final plat, and the name of that is for Rohr's 34th Avenue redevelopment. Again, it should be scrolling on the bottom of the screen, but to provide testimony, there may be a few folks that want to provide testimony this evening. You can call that number that's on the screen, the 1-888 number, and then the conference code is 5305-684543. So I'll just leave this on just for a moment, and then I'll go back to the recommendation slide. So with that, Mr. Chair, I'm happy to answer questions.
All right, thank you, Mr. Centenario. I'll start with a couple questions just for clarification. The retaining wall that's there now and the separation to the steep slopes, the bluff, versus the new retaining wall, is there any conflict with our bluff standards with that? And again, even the issue of the new retaining wall will require some construction below that. It's not as if they can't touch the area towards the river when they construct that new retaining wall.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, great question. So our bluff protection standards do apply in this area. And planning commissioners may recall the city went through an extensive study process and rewrote our bluff protection ordinance, or the ordinance section. And there are some additional requirements. Development is not prohibited by any means. We do prohibit development below the 760-foot elevation. I believe the lowest point on this project is about 785. So we're still well above that prohibited level. But essentially what the applicant is going to have to do is they're going to have to hire a team of engineers, and they're going to have to provide a lot of analysis and documentation. They've provided some very preliminary review of essentially, which is essentially is, we reviewed the proposal, we've gone out, we've seen the bluff, and we feel that this development can be built without impacting the slope. And that's a great first opinion, but before a permit is issued, they have to certify with their analysis that they're not going to negatively impact the slope, and also not create drainage issues or change the hydrology of the site. So there is, while we think it's very doable within the confines of our bluff protection standards, there's some work that they'll have to do before we sign off on any permits.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Senator. One other question, and I didn't hear it on this particular application that we normally hear or with many of our other housing, is just the analysis of in-unit or storage space.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, another good question. So the storage, that's a topic that often is discussed and debated. The storage requirements are different between just non-age restricted and age restricted. So the age restricted housing, it does have a storage requirement, but it is an in-unit storage requirement. So there's certain dimension and volume requirements within the unit, whereas just a non-age restricted development, like the Fenley across the street, mm-hmm. there is a requirement that is outside the unit. So a separate, storage locker, if you will, elsewhere in the building. And so I don't believe the applicant has finalized their floor and unit plans yet. And so that's something that we'll have to confirm when we're doing our review, that they meet those dimensional standards for the in-unit storage.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Centenary. I wasn't quite sure about that. It sounds, like that's reviewed during the building permit, the specifics. So I appreciate the response on that. Commissioner Roman, you have a question?
Yes, Mr. Chair, I think I have a couple. Mr. Centenario, we've had a few projects in this area, and we've heard over time about capacity issues with sanitary. I see their reference to it in the findings about there's sufficient capacity once planned improvements are complete. Where are we at on that? We've been adding a fair number of things, and if we are close to capacity, I would hate to have us in a situation where we approve something that either can't be occupied or creates a problem for the city later on.
Yeah, thank you, Commissioner Roman. So there are planned improvements to sewer capacity. As part of our review process, we of course have our utility engineers. They do that. They complete that review, and they didn't find there to be any significant conflicts. I think a lot of the issues that have been raised relate to development is a little farther north. So I can't speak to exactly how the services are organized from street to street, but it is something that was reviewed, and given the improvements that are in the works and will be constructed, they felt that that the city could adequately serve this development.
Okay, Mr. Chair.
Go ahead.
One other question, Mr. Centenari. The report indicates that the parking study talks about residential and office typically being uses that are compatible, which I think is probably very true in most situations. I think long-term tales of what we've learned from the pandemic may inform us long-term, but in the short term with this project, this is an age-restricted project intended or aimed at people who are seniors. Most people I know who are seniors don't work full-time or during business hours. So I wonder, is there any consideration or modification given to the study when we may not be seeing complementary parking, but in fact conflicting parking?
Sure, Mr. Chair, Commissioner Roman. Well, that's a really good point. I don't think that was included directly in the study. I would say that based on the anticipated peak demand that was included in the study, there's a really substantial delta between the parking supply that's proposed and what the study anticipated as a peak demand. So even if that kind of that shared use of the parking isn't quite perfect from what was, well, I mean, it's a model, so it's not going to be perfect, but it isn't quite right. I think we have an extra buffer in this scenario where we're not going to run into parking problems.
Okay, because again, my main thing is we're in a part of town where there intentionally is not a lot of surplus parking. So example, this project, people have guests at whatever the timing is, and we do run it, or the office has visitors or clients or whatever. There's just not a lot of, or before too long, there won't be much surplus parking in the area. So clearly there's people who are more expert at this than I am, but I think that's something that is probably less likely to follow the model.
Understood. Thank you.
Any further questions, Commissioner Roman?
No, sir.
All right. Commissioner Abdi, did you still have a question?
Yes, Mr. Chair. I had two questions, but I found the answer. One of them in the report was regarding setbacks. The question I had remaining was about height. I think we did receive a comment that one condo owner believes that the proposed project would block the view. Can you maybe explain a little bit about view accessibility? I know developments that come before certain projects that are closer to the bluff will no longer have those views. Are there rights to views here, or are there, I know with the project proposed, it meets the minimum height or the overall height allowed for the location. But can you maybe explain a little bit about folks who might be watching who have a condo or a residential in this area that relied on that view when they bought it, but now with the development coming up that potentially blocks their view? Can you maybe explain a little bit about just that topic in general? Thank you.
Sure. Mr. Chair, Commissioner, I don't believe that folks that are accustomed to having or have had a certain view for the last 20 or so years have a vested right to continue that. That from a planning perspective, this area has been planned and guided for high density development, really our most intense development within the city, and is zoned as such. Our HXR district is our high density mixed use development with residential. And so in that case, we have minimum FAR requirements of 1.5 FAR, which is pretty dense for a suburban community. And so, inevitably, when we have a development that meets our comprehensive and district plan, as well as meets our zoning requirements, it's going to have to be multi-level, multi-story development. And that's the case here. And so while, it's folks that are losing a view if they're on the lower stories, that is unfortunate for them. But in order to accommodate and implement the development that we'd like to see in this area, it does require to be multi-story. And so the folks that, in Reflections, for example, across the way, if they're, at a certain level, their views will change, but I would say are not negatively impacted. But it is also different. Instead of a surface parking lot, you'd be looking at an attractive building. So there's certainly a number of ways to look at it.
Any further questions, Commissioner Abdi?
No, thank you very much.
All right, and if I can, Mr. Centenario, one other question that I know we had some correspondence on, and that's just about refuse storage. And can you elaborate on that from the correspondence? I know there was a question about, is that allowed outside, I think on the far eastern side of the project?
Sure, Mr. Chair. Let me get to a different graphic that shows that better. So yeah, it was a good question. Related to refuse and where you can put trash receptacles. And so the city code requires that trash receptacles be stored within the building. And that is what the applicant's proposing to do. They are proposing trash rooms within the building. Now, they also need to figure out where they're going to put the trash receptacles for pickup. And the garbage truck needs to be able to get at those receptacles. So that's what this loading and refuse area is intended. It is not their intent, nor is it permitted to just leave the trash bins out there permanently. Of course, you have to take them out. Typically, it's either the night before or the morning of pickup, and then bring them in later that day. And so on pickup day, yeah, there will be receptacles out here, but then they would have to move them back in within the parking structure area.
All right, so that's really no different than any other larger housing development that we have.
Exactly. Yeah. Every high density development, they have a trash room, and they have, I forget how many, what the dimensions of those are, but I think we all kind of have an idea of what they look like, and they have to roll them out to a designated area for pickup.
All right, thank you. Commissioner Roman, you have another question?
I do. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Centenari, could you refresh my memory? Under the OHO, in this case, 14 units, those are typically defined units, right? They're we have different standards for finishes and things like that, or where you can change your finishes. Is that accurate?
In terms of, well, I'm not familiar or don't recall those standards. I don't believe there's really going to be much of a difference in the finishes. Maybe that's something that they add.
Yeah, my question isn't so much about that. And it's more of a question for the applicant, but I want to understand the staff side about it. It gets to, the OHO summary talks about the affordable units will be located throughout the building and available on each floor. And my question was for the applicant was going to be about, will they all be restricted to a street side view, or will some have a river view? And what I was getting at is if those units are specifically constructed to meet the affordable target with a different level of essentially finisher. I thought that was part of the ordinance when we passed it, but I just trying to figure out how we ensure that we aren't just putting all of our affordable units with a view of the empty or the building wall next door.
Sure, understood. I think the applicant could address if they've been able to determine, I guess where the units are located. But as you mentioned, they have identified it would be distributed through the building, but I don't know if they've determined, whether it's a street side or a bluff side.
No, and that's okay. I was just trying to more understand that it's one thing to designate those 14 units spread out at the time of you open it, but then if over time they all migrate to a spot, I don't know if we have any enforcement ability on that.
All right, Commissioner Roman, any other questions, or would you look for some clarity from Mr. Markegard on that, on the opportunity housing ordinance?
If he has anything, otherwise I can certainly just ask the question of the applicant as well.
We'll look towards that direction and continue on. Any further questions for staff from commission members? Not seeing any further questions for staff. Mr. Markegard, is the applicant available to speak to this item?
Yes, Mr. Chair, we're joined tonight by Shane Lefebvre and James Riley. Mr. Lefebvre, the WebEx is not allowing me to make you a panelist, so I will unmute you. And then Mr. Riley is a panelist, and you can mute and unmute yourself.
Excellent. Well, thank you, everyone, and good evening. This is James Riley with Roars Companies. I'm a senior development associate and working on this project with Shane Lefebvre. I think Mr. Centenario did a great job of presenting this project, and I'm happy to answer any additional questions. But in regards to the opportunity housing units, these exact units have not been determined quite yet, but it is our intention that every unit has the exact same finishes or comparable finishes to the rest of the units in the property, and that they'll be evenly distributed between the levels on both sides, both street-facing and bluff-facing sides.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Riley. Mr. excuse me, Mr. Roman, Commissioner Roman, do you have any further questions for the applicant on that?
No, that clarifies. Thank you.
Okay, all right. Are there any other questions for the applicants from commission members? Not seeing any at this point. Thank you, Mr. Riley, for your information. Do you have anything else you'd like to add for us?
No, just want to appreciate everyone for their time and their consideration of our project. We're certainly excited about this one and hope we can develop a project that suits the needs of the community and city goals.
All right. Thank you. Appreciate that and appreciate you being here tonight to answer any questions that we may have. All right. Now that the applicant has spoken, at this point, to open the public hearing, Mr. Markegard, is there anybody from the public to speak to this first item?
Mr. Chairman, we do have callers tonight,
Okay.
so I will check in with Mr. Pease. I will unmute you now.
Yes, I have 3 callers. I'll get their names and put them through accordingly. So give me a couple of minutes or a minute probably.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Pease. And just a reminder for everybody that will be speaking tonight, we do try and be respectful of the time it takes for each one of these items. And so I would ask if you can limit your comments to 3 minutes for us tonight. We do have some written comments in front of us. Certainly, once everybody's had a chance to speak, if there is additional need to relay your comment, you'll be given another 2 minutes.
All right, Mr. Chair, we're just waiting for Mr. Pease to confirm the attendees. Mr. Pease, I will unmute you now.
Well, 3, you're calling?
He's still talking with them.
Okay.
Just another.
We'll give it just a couple minutes.
Mr. Pease, I will unmute you now.
Yes, the first caller, her name's Judy. Judy, you are open to do your testimony. Please state your name and spell your name for the record before you start the testimony.
My name is Judy Jones, Juddyjones. I am a resident of Bloomington, and my question regarding this development is in regards to the complete streets policy, looking at the additional number of vehicles as well as people will be coming into this area. I'm just wondering how the city is going to address complete streets. I know from a cycling perspective, this is a route that's used often for commuting as well as for recreational use. And so I just want to see how the city wants to work proactively to stay ahead of the additional roughly 300 cars and vehicles that will be added to this road, and creating safety for cyclists and pedestrians that will be added to the roads at this point.
All right. Thank you, Judy. This is Chair Solberg again. And
thank you.
Just a reminder that as you ask your questions, if the Planning Commission feels that there's additional information that needs to be asked of the applicant or staff, we will go ahead and do that. And we will try and get through all the questions as appropriate. Are you still there, Judy?
Judy, are you still there?
Yes, I am.
Okay. All right. I just wanted to make sure that you're aware of that we will, the Planning Commission will address those questions as we deem necessary as well. All right? Thank you. Any further questions?
Whoops.
What?
Chair, I apologize. I muted her when you asked her if there's any further questions.
Okay, all right. We're working through this. This is okay. Judy, did you have any further comments?
No, I just hadn't heard the response. So
Okay, all right. We'll work on that. Thank you. All right, Mr. Pease, could we go to our next individual?
Yes, Tom, I now have you ready for testimony. If you could please state your full name and spell it for the record.
Yeah, you're fine. You just muted.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Great. I'm Tom Fahey. I live here in Bloomington in 8121, the building directly east of the proposed development. And I happen to live on the very west side within a few feet of their property line. I've got two general comments and then three specific. One, I just want to commend you all that certainly support additional well-planned multi-unit buildings in the South Loop area. And thank you for your work on that. Second, looking forward to reaching a critical mass or a critical number of residents to support businesses within walking distance of the area. And specifically, our top priority happens to be a grocery store. I'd like to move to specifics about the development, and I'd like to thank Mike for covering the first item, the trees, removal of trees on the northeast side of the property. And I'd just like to reinforce in my testimony our request to have significant screening and landscaping all along that property line. Second, there was a little discussion about the retaining wall. I did not catch that earlier. My question is there a setback requirement from the property line for retaining walls, specifically along that northeast property line?
Okay. Any further questions, Mr. Fahey?
Well, I'll keep going with my questions then. A second question, can anyone answer how far that retaining wall is from 8121 existing building? And then lastly, the Refuge area. We happen to be very concerned about that, even on a temporary basis, seeing that our solarium is probably within 20 feet of we're on the second floor, within 20 feet of our solarium open windows, and we would prefer not to ever have a trash sitting out there that close to our area where we'd be sitting out in the solarium.
Okay.
And that's the end of my testimony, requests, questions, and I appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you, Mr. Fahey, and that is exactly 3 minutes. I appreciate your timeliness on that. All right, and Mr. Pease, is there yet another individual that'd like to speak to this application?
Yes, I have Barb on the line. Barb, if you could please state your name and spell it for the record. You're ready to testify.
Thank you, Mr. Pease. This is Barbara Wolf, Barbara Wolffs. I also live in 8121 34th Avenue, same building as caller number 2. I have 2 questions this evening. The first one is if the applicant could speak to the height of the building and how that will compare to our building. And the second question came up at our association meeting last night from another owner as to will this new proposed building, will they be participating in the snow plowing that takes place around Apple Tree, as it's a private area that we hire for snow plowing, as they will be using the entrance and exit at the light. That's all. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Barb Wolf, for your comments tonight, and especially timely in the winter question about snow plowing. All right. Mr. Pease, do we have anybody else that has joined us in the last couple minutes?
Chair, there are no other callers on the line.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Pease. All right, commission members, it seemed like there were several questions in there, and I think some of this potentially to staff and others to the applicant. Just looking through these, Mr. Markegard or Mr. Centenario, can you speak to retaining wall setbacks?
Sure, Mr. Chair. There's different scenarios with regard to retaining walls, and then depending on the scenario, there's a different setback requirement. So generally, one of the standards relates to retaining walls within easements. Generally speaking, we do not want a retaining wall within a public easement, like a drainage and utility easement, for example. Obviously we don't want a wall where that would disrupt the conveyance of drainage, for example. There is no public easement along this property line, so that's not a consideration. Another consideration is if the retaining wall is 4 feet or less, we don't have the the same setback requirements as if it was obviously a much larger structural retaining wall. So this retaining wall in that particular area is quite limited. It doesn't have it's not the tremendous retaining wall that you're going to see south of there. So in this case, and there's also a planned development where we treat the interior lot lines a little bit differently. So in this case, I think the retaining wall is roughly between 4 or 5 feet at that corner. And so given there's no easement and this is a planned development, the proposed setback is consistent with our standards.
I'm just trying to answer the questions I think here that Mr. Fahey asked. And it's really
Sounds like you may have lost me. Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
I can.
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Okay.
Okay.
Did I break up at all, or I was getting yes, I can.
Okay. I'm not sure if my microphone was off or if your microphone wasn't working. I'll ask the question again. How about we go with that? Just to move forward with one of Mr. Fahey's questions. So based on that retaining wall and meeting the setbacks, there's not really any way for us at this point to know what the distance is between the retaining wall and that neighboring property building, unless we know what their setback was.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, I don't know that distance offhand between the retaining wall and the building. I think the setback between the retaining wall and the property line, I believe, is about 6 or 7 feet. Okay. And then there's a small setback between the property line and the building. I could measure that, but I'd probably have to stop sharing and go into a different program. But I could find that answer during if Planning Commission wants to make their comments, I could figure that out.
I think, Mr. Centenario, the important thing to us is that they meet the requirements at this point, and the rest is maybe curiosity for us. One other issue that would like some additional discussion on, and I think we have a pretty good idea, but Judy Jones had asked a question about complete streets policy. And while we had the site plan, I was trying to look for sidewalk and those sorts of amenities and what was the continuance through that area. Can you provide some additional detail on that?
Absolutely, Mr. Chair. Let me see if I can get to the site plan, and I can talk about some of those elements. So unfortunately, I can't speak to, I'm not very knowledgeable on what the city has envisioned within the street itself.
And we'll ask the city engineer for that.
Okay. But in terms of on site and immediately adjacent to the site, what sort of elements are we mindful of to make cycling and pedestrian movements safer? One is, of course, with cycling, we do understand that folks are cycling in this area, myself included, and so we want a minimum sidewalk width. So in this location, the minimum width is 8 feet. And in this location, we do have wider than normal sidewalks. So you have a wider concrete sidewalk, and then there's some additional kind of stamped concrete that is wider than your typical residential sidewalk. So it does accommodate pedestrians and cycling. And then immediately, let me get to a different graphic here. I'm going to show you close to the entrance. Of course, and if you're cycling, you need a place to locate your bike. So there are bike racks that are immediately adjacent to the sidewalk. And I do believe that the applicant is intending on having bike storage within the building itself. So between providing an urban character, that's certainly a district-wide goal. Having sidewalk accommodations for pedestrians, cyclists, bike storage. And then overall, just a pleasant public realm experience, where we have landscaping adjacent to sidewalks in the streets, I think is consistent with our, South Loop District Plan and our vision for this area.
All right, thank you, Mr. Centenario. Is Julie Long, are you available? Could you speak to complete streets and what's any plans for 34th Avenue?
I am available. Thank you, Mr. Chair. We know that this is an important multimodal route, and it shows up in our alternative transportation plan to construct a 10-foot wide off-road trail in the future. So as part of the Plat, we are retaining a 10-foot bikeway easement for that future trail.
All right. Thank you very much. Appreciate that information. All right. I think that answers the ones that we need from staff. The other would be remaining for the applicant, and that's really about parking or snow plowing and really building height, I think, in comparison to the other building, unless you would happen to know that, Mr. Centenario.
I do have an idea of the height. And so this building is proposed to be 6 stories. The condominium building is 5. So right there, you have a 1-story difference in the, just the height of the building itself. But then also the condominium building is a little bit lower to the east. And so, the difference from like a above sea level elevation is about 25, maybe 30 feet between those two sites. And that accounts for the additional level of residential use, as well as just the difference in grade, that the condominium site is just a little bit lower.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Centenario. All right. Any questions that any other commissioners feel need to be asked or answered at this point? Not seeing any from the commission members. I would entertain a motion to close the public hearing.
So moved, Commissioner Roman.
Commissioner Roman with the motion to close the public hearing. Is there a second?
Commissioner Solberg, I'll second that.
All right. We have a motion to close the public hearing and a second from Commissioner Albrecht. Hearing no further discussions, all those in favor say aye by roll call. Commissioner Roman?
Aye.
Commissioner Albrecht?
Aye.
Commissioner Abdi?
Aye.
Commissioner, myself, I guess Commissioner Cookdon is out of this particular discussion. So motion passes. Public hearing is now closed. Is there discussion amongst commission members? Commissioner Roman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think this project meets the intention of the development we would like to see in this area. I do still have some reservations about the parking issue. I think that, well, we'll have to see what happens. I mean, the best we can do is rely on the judgment of experts, but it's a little bit concerning that the experts don't have a variable for housing that is people who don't necessarily work full time. But beyond that, I think I appreciate the public comment. I think we heard some responses to many of those. Some of those are just going to be the way they're going to be. I recognize that that's not what people want to hear, but they are within the bounds of what's acceptable based on the code. So I'm in support of this project.
All right. Thank you, Commissioner Roman. I guess there is, I just remembered, I had said we had the one additional question for the applicant. And I would like to, maybe Mr. Centenario can track that down. It's private property, so I imagine that has to be a discussion between the property owners.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, you're right. This is private property, and there's shared access between several different, both the office building, but there's a whole bunch of development to the north, and so there are existing agreements that are in place for shared access. You know, with a new development, I suspect that some of those agreements are going to have to be amended, and that's going to be a discussion and a negotiation between those private parties.
Yeah. All right. Thank you. As I suspected. All right. Any other discussion from commission members? I myself will say I think I'm generally in support of the project. I think, you know, the questions that were brought up about landscaping, east side, some of the discussions about where or how close they are. Unfortunately, I think with the concern about garbage or refuse pickup, it's an unfortunate detail, but garbage has to be picked up. It has to be available for the haulers. It's a relatively short time frame, generally, right? Hours out of the week, not days. And to the point of parking, Commissioner Roman, you know, I think I might be a little more concerned about that, other than having the LRT in very close proximity. I think that's going to play a big role here compared to if this were, say, on the west side of Bloomington somewhere where there's just not that same access to transit. But for those reasons, I can support the application. Any other commissioners?
I believe Commissioner Albrecht has a hand up.
Oh, I can't, unfortunately, I guess I can't see that. Commissioner Albrecht.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I would echo some of the same comments that Commissioner Solberg and Commissioner Roman made regarding the project. I think it's a great life cycle housing project, particularly for this area. I think overall, the developer has done a great job in preserving some of the older tree stock on the property. I too question some of the parking demand and absorption given the clientele living at the property. However, I do believe that having the LRT stop very, very close by does mitigate some of that. And overall, I'm in support of this project.
All right, thank you, Commissioner Albrecht. Any other commissioners would like to speak to this item? Otherwise, I would entertain a motion.
Mr. Chair,
Go ahead, Commissioner Roman.
I'd make a motion. In case PL 2020-231, having been able to make the required findings, I move to recommend City Council approve major revisions to the preliminary development plan and final development plans for a 6-story, 146-unit age-restricted apartment building at 8131 34th Avenue South, subject to the conditions and code requirements attached to the staff report.
All right, we have a motion. Do we have a second, Commissioner Albrecht?
I'll second that.
All right, we have a motion and a second to approve the preliminary and final development plans for a 6-story, 146-unit age-restricted apartment building at 8131 34th Avenue. Is there, hearing no further discussion, all those in favor say aye by roll call. Commissioner Roman?
Aye.
Commissioner Albrecht?
Aye.
Commissioner Abdi?
Aye.
And aye for myself. Motion passes. All right. And for this particular item, we have a second motion. I'm looking to one of the Planning Commission members. Commissioner Albrecht?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In case PL 2020-231, having been able to make the required findings, I move to recommend City Council approve the preliminary plat and adopt a resolution approving a final plat for Rohr's 34th Avenue redevelopment, subject to the conditions and code requirements attached to the staff report.
All right. Thank you, Commissioner Albrecht. Is there a second? Commissioner Abdi?
Second.
All right, we have a motion and a second to approve preliminary plat and adopt a resolution approving the final plat for Rohr's 34th Avenue redevelopment. All those in favor, or seeing no further discussion, all those in favor say aye by roll call. Commissioner Roman?
Aye.
Commissioner Albrecht?
Aye.
Commissioner Abdi?
Aye.
And myself as an aye. Motion passes. That concludes item number 1. That will move to City Council for approval on February 8th. Thank you to the public and the applicants for being available tonight and providing your comments. Now we will move on to study session, and I would like to remind our public viewing this tonight that these are not public hearings. They are study session items for the Planning Commission to give feedback and recommendations on. And with that, Mr. Markergaard, I believe we have Cindy Harper and John Dillery from Metro Transit to give information on this first item, Metro Transit update on proposed route changes. And
good evening.
Welcome back, Commissioner Cookton, and welcome, Cindy Harper.
Thank you very much. Good evening, commissioners. Are you able to hear me okay?
We sure can.
All right, excellent. Okay, my name is Cindy Harper. I am the manager of route planning with Metro Transit in our service development department. And with me today is John Dillery. He's a senior transit planner, also in our service development area. He's the project manager. So I'm going to start off with just a little bit of background information and then turn it over to John for the details about the specific route changes proposed within Bloomington. And then at the end, circle back and I'll talk a little bit about equity and our public comment period. So the Orange Line process initially started, the connecting bus study at least, initially started back in fall of 2019. However, we had to put the project on pause due to COVID, and then we restarted work again last fall. And now we're ready to bring our proposed changes out to the public for feedback. First, a little background on the Orange Line itself. There are 2 stations in Bloomington at American Boulevard and at 98th Street. The Orange Line will replace most of Route 535 with much more frequent all day, 7 days a week service in Bloomington compared to today's Route 535. run every 10 minutes in the rush hour, every 15 minutes at other times. Replaces not only Route 535, but also Route 597. John will talk about those more in a minute. And the project is, it's been under construction for now a couple of years. We are on schedule to open late this year. Here are our project goals and the study area. So the map on the right shows a big orange line down the middle is the orange line, of course. There are 11 routes shown here in blue. Those are key routes that have changes that will be proposed. In addition, there's 5 routes shown in dark gray, mostly in South Minneapolis. Those are also routes that will serve an orange line station, but don't have any changes proposed. And then the thin gray lines in the background are other routes in the area that are continuing to operate. In order to maximize the extent and the access to the benefits of the new orange line, our goals included making sure we connect more than 50,000 jobs outside of downtown with the orange line, prioritizing those who rely on transit the most, and always, of course, we're always looking for ways to simplify our route structure to make them easier to understand and easier to use. On the right is a map of the proposed route changes, which we will explore in more detail in just a minute. Since we still don't know for sure what the transit market and travel demand will be when Orange Line opens, the concept plan will present 2 different scenarios. Scenario A matches today's resources, and Scenario B reflects pre-pandemic level of resources. If demand returns, we could reinvest some resources into Scenario B. Scenario A meets our goals of replacing the local service not covered by the Orange Line itself, and also improving the connectivity between the Orange Line and the jobs, other key destinations such as Normandale College in the study area. Scenario B builds on this by improving the span, frequency, and days of the week that service is available in the study area. And now I'll turn it over to John for to walk us through the specific changes.
Okay, I hope everyone can hear me. Thank you, Cindy.
Yes, we can hear you, John.
Okay, I always like to be sure. In Bloomington, Route 535 has lots of stops. It has 80 stops from end to end, and there's far fewer stations on the Orange Line. So right away we have an access challenge, of course, and we don't just assume that everybody can walk to stations on the Orange Line. Far from it. Connecting bus service is crucial, and so you'll hear me say replaces Route 535 or part of it. That means that's really a big priority in our thinking, and you'll hear me talk about impacts in a few places, which means some people are affected by a change in route or a trade-off. Anyway, we'll start geographically in the north edge of the city here along 494. What we show here is American Boulevard Station in the middle, and Route 535 today distributes passengers coming off 35W to businesses on the Bloomington side of things between Penn Avenue and Lyndale Avenue, especially near Penn Avenue in American Boulevard. And we are going to straighten out the crosstown bus routes. And one thing that's very notable is even though it's suspended right now, Route 542 is restored. I think it's a good idea. It goes, that's the blue line on American Boulevard from Mall of America straight west, all the way across the north edge of the city. Previously, the route jogged up to 76th Street because that's where the best connections were for the 535 and Best Buy headquarters. Now we'll rely on other connections for that. So we're at new bus stops on American Boulevard between Lyndale and Knox, and we're going to have our Knox American Station connection. Now, because we made the American Boulevard route direct and clean like that, we can continue with the same number of buses. We can continue beyond Normandale Lake. Today we end there. Now we're proposing to go through out to East Bush Lake Road and then go along 78th Street and along the north edge of the city where you meet with Edina near the Bremer Park over to Highway 169. There might be an opportunity for us to connect with Southwest Transit service to the Golden Triangle, which is off to the west. And the service to the 538 service rather in 86th Street, and will also help distribute passengers. There's nothing changing there much, except under the scenario B, we might be able to invest more, and we'd make the 538 run every half hour during the day. But the big difference would be the 542, which would go from being a rush hour route to something that runs all day long, every 30 minutes, 60 minutes, and on weekends. So that's something we hope we can do eventually. Now, the next slide, I think we can move on to talk about other coverages. Here's a route showing, or a map showing the routes near 35W. And here's a real positive change, I think, I'll explain. The 535 serves Lyndale Avenue near 94th Street, down near where the 98th Street station is shown. South Bloomington Transit Center being renamed 98th Street Station. Volunteers enlisted to assist people, Hennepin County Services, just north of where the 98th Street Station, but a little bit far to walk, are served well by Route 534, which, unlike today's Route 535, will run all day long on Lyndale. And we're going to serve Lyndale Avenue with a route that runs all day long between 98th Street Station and American Boulevard Station. You see it there in purple, looping along 82nd, Knox, and back on American Boulevard. And in rush hours, we'll divert trips to go via James Avenue and 94th to serve the Central Bloomington Industrial Park. And 2 buses will operate. We'll have 20-minute service in the peaks, which is more frequent than we've had. And we'll have 30-minute service running all day long very efficiently. If we can invest more in scenario B, we'll run it. We'd like to run it on weekends besides. So there's an improved area there. Transfer to the orange line and get better frequency. The part of Lyndale south of 99th Street down to 102nd Street is now served by some rush hour 535s, but it's not there anymore. So we propose to reroute the 553 commuter express bus that runs on Portland Avenue. Instead of turning on Old Shakopee Road, it'll go in 102nd to Lyndale and start at the 98th Street Station. It creates a new connection opportunity. And that's the Lyndale Avenue service. So I'll move along now to the next slide. Excuse me. Now we move down to 98th Street. The 535 local service on 98th Street is very important west of 35W. Normandale Community College has contributed 100 people to our Route 535 every weekday during school year. Normandale College is one of the top destinations on the route, but the orange line is quite a distance away. So we feel a real priority is to restructure, redesign the red Route 539 crosstown route. They'll serve Mall of America and Old Shakopee Road East, 98th Street, come to the station. But west of 35W, it's completely remodeled. It'll be proposed to be a straight 98th Street route to Normandale College and on to Normandale Village, where we have a lot of population and a destination. This bus route would run every 30 minutes most hours and 30 minutes or 60 minutes on weekends, and that's an improvement over the current route on weekends. In the mornings, because we know that's peak time for Normandale College, everyone's trying to get to class, Route 539 will run every 20 minutes, bus for every other orange line at 98th Street. Now, of course, when you straighten out and shorten and make 98th Street the route for the 539, we need to cover what is now part of Route 539, and that's shown on Old Shakopee Road in purple, France Avenue, Normandale College, but also Penn Avenue up towards Penn American. We need to create a fill-in route, so it's new Route 536. Route 536 would run about the same hours of service that 539 does today, but a little less frequent. They'll be going on American Boulevard, down Penn Avenue, and straight down Penn Avenue to Old Shakopee Road, because there's really one of the strengths of ridership is Old Shakopee Road, especially out near France. And then through 108th Street Apartments and Valley West Shopping Center and straight up to Normandale College. And 539 will run every day of the week. Now, with our basic scenario, we don't restore the France Avenue Crosstown Route 537, that's shown in green here, up and down France. That route, if we can go to scenario B, would be restored on weekdays The reason I point that out is you see the gray along 90th Street and Penn. That's showing the current Route 539, and we are proposing to eliminate the 90th Street branch or portion of the route. There's about 9 people that ride regularly, at least as of 2019. And fortunately, most of them are walking distance from Penn Avenue. But there is a pocket of some riders over at France and 90th, and they're probably coming from the apartment buildings. So that's an impact we have to keep an eye on. That's basically the changes in that part of Bloomington. Now, moving right along, Cindy mentioned we're not going to have the Route 597 Express, which is a route that serves Southwest Bloomington today. It's had 2 branches, one on West 102nd and one down Old Shakopee Road and the neighborhoods around there. The route's going to be, the ridership can be accommodated by the new Orange Line running every 10 minutes with 60-foot buses. And so instead of 597, the concept here is replace it with the Orange Line and these new local routes. Branches 547 becomes a new local route between 98th Street Station, Old Shakopee Road, west in the morning to the considerable population of jobs, the Southwest Bloomington industrial area, 111th, changing the route to go up Hampshire up to Quality Bike Products on 105th, out to 106th. Same bus comes back along Auto Club Road, Normandale, Boulevard, and 110th, pick up the residents, bring them over to 98th Street Station to get on their Orange Line, or any other bus they want. That bus would run every 30 minutes during the complete peak period, morning and the afternoon. Now, the 102nd Street branch is restructured from the current 597 because, as I mentioned just earlier, we got the 539 creating a direct crosstown on 98th Street from Normandale Village all the way across to 98th Street Station. So the 548 goes in the Green Line. We're proposing to run on Highland Green Drive by the apartment buildings there for the first time for easier access, and then down to 102nd and keep the route on 102nd to new bus stops east of Xerxes, right over to Old Shakopee Road. So we'll have a direct connection there. That's also a 30-minute frequency peak periods. And that's all the route specific changes we have mapped here for the city of Bloomington. So I think, Cindy, you're going to talk about the hotspots and things, or should I?
If you can cover the hotspots, that'd be great.
Very good. Well, I did mention them as I went along. This lists all the hotspots everywhere, including some near Richfield. I mentioned 90th Street between France and Penn. The 597, of course, I'll be honest, of course, the 597 is a 1-seat ride from Southwest Bloomington. It's almost nonstop from 98th Street to downtown Minneapolis. Now it'll be getting on the Orange Line, which makes a few stops. It's a few minutes slower than the 597. And then, of course, we have to allow transfer intervals, short, but we still have to allow transfer intervals. So it's a nice, frequent, very simple service, 10-minute frequency on the Orange Line, but of course, it's a little slower ride. Then, of course, if we have to stick with today's resources for a while, then the American Boulevard service doesn't have any off-peak trips, at least to begin with. We'll probably hear about that. And then really the 537, that's the France Avenue from Valley West up to Southdale. That's remaining suspended will be an issue. And that's the hotspot list. I think the next slide might be about our coverage and equity.
Yes, it does. I'll take that. Thank you, John.
Thank you.
So it's really important that we understand the impacts of these proposed changes, especially for communities of color and those who are experiencing poverty. So we start by reviewing maps that shows where Black, Indigenous, and people of color, as well as low-income communities, live within the study area. We want to pay particular attention to the green dots, which represent either low income or community of color. Each dot on this map signifies 50 people. This information is done by census block level, so there is a significant amount of detail here. Since this project meets the Met Council's definition of a major service change, the Federal Transit Administration requires us to conduct a formal service equity analysis in order to determine if the proposed changes potentially have a disparate impact or disproportionate burden on protected populations. One note here, just very quickly, at the Met Council, of course, we prefer to use more inclusive language, such as communities of color. But for this specific slide, I will use the FTA terminology of minority and non-minority. So the map in the upper right shows the change in the number of weekly trips that will be available. Green means more trips. Keep in mind that the colors on the map are not tied to demographics, but we do need to also consider the maps that were on the previous slide that showed where those who rely on transit the most live in order to have a more complete picture. The FTA allows each region to determine its own threshold for disparate impact or disproportionate burden. So our benchmark is 80%. This isn't a hard line, but rather a goal that indicates if additional work is needed in order to interpret or explain the results or to mitigate some of the impacts. The average study area resident will have an increase in service of 27.6%. So the question here is whether low-income and minority communities are seeing at least 80% of the increase in service that more affluent and white areas will receive. And the results show that we are at or above the 80% mark. However, as we dig into the data a little deeper, it highlights some of the limitations of the methodology. First of all, the methodology relies on census data, which assumes that the only people who use a particular route live along that route. It doesn't factor in trips to jobs, other key destinations for people who live on elsewhere and are transferring to these routes. Also, percentages can be misleading. For example, the restoration of suspended Route 537 and Route 542 are both showing as 100% increases, which might influence the calculations. So in order to better understand how the proposed services will improve access to jobs in the study area, we have mapped the areas with a change in jobs that can be accessed in under 45 minutes with our new proposal. There's lots of green shown in the study area on both maps during the peak period and during the midday. And green indicates a significant increase to jobs in Bloomington, Richfield, Edina, and Burnsville. It's also important to better understand who can access these jobs. So this bar chart shows that everyone will see an increase in the number of jobs they can access on transit compared to today's baseline, regardless of race or income. However, the tallest columns are for Black, Indigenous, people of color, and low-income groups. They will benefit more, especially in the off-peak. So finally, here's the work that will happen after our public engagement phase. Between that and implementation, we will be taking back all of the feedback we received in January and February and making modifications to the plan as appropriate in the spring. And then we will circle back with our stakeholders to let you know what the modifications are, and we will be asking the Met Council for final approval in June. And then these changes would be implemented the same time that the orange line opens. The public comment period actually started on Monday, the 25th. And now our focus has definitely shifted from developing the proposal to getting the word out about the proposed changes. We're doing this using a variety of approaches listed here, both virtual or online and in person. We want to make sure that we're hearing from a diverse set of riders, also keeping in mind that there's a lot of people who are very interested in these changes who aren't currently riding with us due to the pandemic. There's several ways for people to give their feedback, including 2 community meetings and a public hearing that will be virtual. Also, by completing a survey, we have a map-based survey that we've developed that's on our project website that really does a nice job of walking people through the proposal and then asking very specific targeted questions about the changes in order to get feedback. Also, we have a project email address, and the council has a public comment line that we will use. We will be translating the survey and the report that's out on the website, as well as our brochure that we'll be handing out to folks in Spanish and in Somali, as well as in English. And we are certainly partnering with a lot of the community organizations, trying to touch base with Normandale. We're briefing the 494 TMO, doing a webinar with them in a couple of weeks. We'll be sending a postcard out to people who live along routes that have significant changes. So lots of different outreach and engagement strategies to help us get the word out. And I'd be happy to take any questions.
All right. Thank you. Thank you for the information. I know just a couple of questions, and it really, before I get into maybe the routes, is the question of, certainly the pandemic has affected transit and transportation in general. Are you seeing differences between, say, the BRTs or the current BRTs and the ridership on those versus station to station ridership?
Well,
maybe John.
BRT lines in general are faring better than than the rest of the system in terms of their resiliency. But for right now, that mostly means the A line and the C line, which is arterial BRT on local streets that stops about every half mile or so. Of course, the A line is Snelling Avenue and Ford Parkway to 46th Street. The C line is Highway 55 and Penn Avenue up in North Minneapolis. So this is the first highway BRT that we will be operating, the orange line. It's very similar to the red line coming out of the Mall of America, which Metro Transit just took over operation of last month. Ridership on the red line hasn't been as resilient as what we've seen on the A and C lines. And then certainly, the orange line, I think that's a bit of a question. There's quite a few commuter and express routes that are currently suspended because folks are working from home instead of taking transit downtown. The orange line certainly will rely on a strong downtown as well, but really the key to that is the connections outside of downtown between the various stations, whether it's going between South Minneapolis and Bloomington, Richfield, or just within the suburban areas themselves, making that a lot easier. So we're certainly keeping an eye on ridership and on transit patterns and what employers are doing, but very optimistic.
Thank you. And just I know John Dillery mentioned the difference. I think I'm trying to remember, maybe is it the 597 that's the express that goes downtown, and the orange line, the time difference?
Right.
What is that difference?
It's an estimate on the orange line sets it at about 4 minutes longer than in the peak hour than the 597. But then, of course, there's some time for transferring. We can make that very short and reliable, but it is what it is.
All right. No, appreciate that. And then I just want to go back to, if we can, slide 12. And as I understand that slide, that is, I think, increase in service versus decrease in service. Is that really what that is showing?
That's correct. The methodology that we use for our Title VI service equity analysis is based on basically the way it measures is looking at the number of weekly trips that serve a specific census block or block group. And so the green is places that are seeing an increase in the number of weekly trips, so weekday, Saturday, and Sunday all factored in there. The purple is areas that are seeing fewer trips than what we have today.
All right. And then just looking at that a little bit, I was trying to overlay it, which would have been maybe because at that level of detail, I can't really tell where those shortages or those reductions are. But is that part of, I think it was referred to as the alternative B that would come back, or?
Partially. So one of the areas, of course, is 90th Street, which John did mention as one of the potential hotspots. Also an area, this is over in Southeast Richfield. We're doing some consolidation on Route 515 over by the airport in Cedar Point Commons. So there's a little bit of an impact there as well. I do want to point out, though, that this map, like I said, is not indicative of demographics. So, for example, John was talking about Southwest Bloomington and all of the employers that are out in this area, Quality Bike Products and such. Right now, so this area, is showing as green, a significant increase in service. If you went back and looked at the map on the previous slide, it's also a pretty affluent area.
Right. Yep.
And so on our map, it's showing as, an increase in service in an area that is predominantly white and affluent. But what this analysis is not taking into consideration is the fact that the main reason we're proposing to run service in this part of Bloomington is for the reverse commute connection, take people riding the orange line from elsewhere to these jobs. That's why we built upon the FTA work here to look at the access to jobs and who had the increase in that, because that wasn't coming through in the initial analysis.
Yeah, and I think really I'm more interested in the purple that's in that northeast corner of Bloomington
American
as a
Boulevard.
reduction, and explaining that a little bit more, because that is an area, I think, of more diversity in Bloomington, both racial and economic, and I'm a little concerned about the reduction in service in that location. So if you have some more information to help us understand what that reduction or how it may come back, that would be appreciated.
Yeah.
John, did you maybe want to, I'll put the slide up about the Route 515. You can talk a little bit about what's happening
Yes, right, Cindy.
in that area.
Yes. We run, commissioners, we run quite a bit of extra service on American Boulevard between 12th Avenue, and that's where that purple area was on the other map, 12th Avenue over to 24th Avenue, simply because we really don't have any other way to go. And the opening of the 77th Street underpass, end of 2022, just north of 494, gives us an opportunity to streamline the Richfield route via 77th Street. But when you do that, you're taking those trips away. And right now there's 20 minutes service or something from America. One of the routes, though, that isn't shown on this map for sake of clarity, actually, but is present, is Route 5 on Portland and American Boulevard. And so it's covering the area where there's more low-income people, you see in pink, very well in that last mile and a half east of Portland. And that route is slated to be replaced by the D line bus rapid transit, and that'll feature slightly better frequency at stations along American Boulevard when it replaces Route 5 in that area. This map isn't reflecting that.
John, would you say it's a fair analysis to say that that portion of American Boulevard, although it will have fewer trips than it has today, will still have a lot of service?
Yes, absolutely. Still have a lot of service, even without complete full restoration of American Boulevard route. It's if the 5 runs every 15 minutes, the D line will run every 10. It's covered, I would say.
Just for clarification, the D line opens when?
I'll just have to think about that, Cindy. What is it, 2023?
Late 2022. We start construction this spring and late next year. So that actually is going to coincide probably fairly close to when Richfield has the 77th Street underpass open.
Yes, that's right.
Until that's open, we will need to continue to travel via 12th Avenue and American Boulevard like we're doing today.
Right. Yeah.
The D line is just not reflected in your analysis for the orange line.
No.
Yeah.
No, it's not.
All right. Thank you. I appreciate that information very much. I know we have a couple other questions for you. I'm not sure who had their hand up first. Was it Commissioner Rubin or Commissioner Cookton? Commissioner Cookton, you get to skip the last one. You get to go first now.
Wow, what an honor. Mr. Chair, can you remind me, this being a study item, is it questions now and discussion later? Or
It's all open. All open.
Okay, thanks. I do have a question. Regarding access to the airport, I'm a frequent public transit user as I work downtown, and I also go to the airport quite often, and it's always been very noticeable that it's next to impossible to get to the airport from anywhere in Bloomington without a transfer to Mall of America. I was wondering if you could just discuss what the difficulty is in having regular route service from somewhere in Bloomington to the airport.
Well, it's, yeah, that's right. All the buses and the train comes together at Mall of America. One of our big challenges is coverage without duplication. But when I say coverage without duplication, I'll be real honest with you and I'll say, and that means connections. It's just, you know, physics of the thing. I guess we have made a deliberate decision to say we have a now upgraded transit center, a station facility at the Mall of America, which is not just a nice place to get on and off transit to go to the Mall of America. Actually, that's half the story. The other big point is it facilitates transfers. And so we want to make the timings work as well as we can to minimize the wait for transfers. But the basic idea was that the blue line would take care of all the linkage to the airport. But yes, it means transfer. Now, with better frequency on Route 539, for one example, it'll be easier to plan a trip from 98th Street and name it, Penn or something, to get to the airport because the connections will be easier because the frequency will be better to meet the 10-minute frequency blue line. But yeah, that's right. It's a deliberate decision in the network. Frequencies and good timing are our best response at the mall.
I appreciate your feedback on that, and I trust the analysis of all the very hardworking folks over at Metro Transit that they're working on that. It's just always been noticeable how difficult it can be to get to the airport, especially when it's cold out. But with the new transfer stop at Mall of America, that certainly has improved. The other thing, and this is not really a question, it's more of just a discussion. The loss of Route 597, I think that's real. As noted, I work downtown and took the 597 every weekday for many years. And that was extremely convenient to have a nonstop service to downtown from South Bloomington, and especially at 98th and Lyndale, where we as a planning commission and a city are really trying to target new development to this area. I think having high quality service to downtown is important. And although I shouldn't say although, I do appreciate the higher frequency on the Orange Line. I think that's a big deal. And having late night service is also a big deal. As a guy who's been known to be stuck at work till 10 or 11 o'clock on occasion, it's a really big luxury to have late night service coming back home. That can't be understated. So I do appreciate that. And although the time loss is only 4 or 5 minutes when you factor in the waiting time, I think every minute counts. One story I was always able to tell at work was that all of my cohorts who lived in South Minneapolis had a longer bus ride than I did because I got express service on the 597 and they had to take local service from South Minneapolis. And it was always awesome to have a faster bus route and live in a better community than they did. It was the perfect package. And that's one of the reasons I continue to choose to live in South Bloomington when I was there. And so I'm disappointed we're losing that express bus service because I think that's a real story that can attract development and attract new residents. Is to say you can get a very fast bus route in a what I would consider to be a better living community than some places you might be. Even if you're closer to the city, you can have possibly more luxuries or more convenience down here in Bloomington. And so I am disappointed we're losing the 597. I would love for Metro Transit to consider many express routes, the 589, you name it, other express routes, have 4 or 6 buses in the morning during the rush, 4 or 6 buses coming back during the evening rush. That way it's not a huge burden on Metro Transit, but it does give you at least rush hour capability to get that express service if you miss it in the evening, no big deal. You just take the Orange Line home and you're right back to where you started. I certainly would love for Metro Transit to consider even limited quantities of buses, but still retaining that express bus service from South Bloomington into downtown. I think that's a big deal as we try to reimagine what we're doing at 98th and Lyndale. So no questions. Those are just my thoughts.
Right. Commissioner Roman?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks to both of you and your teams for all the work on this. I think on the whole, this is a significant improvement in bus service to the city of Bloomington. And I think of kind of the orange line and the blue line is kind of the core arteries, and how do these other routes plug into that? There is kind of, well, I guess the one area I'm seeing now as I look at my other map overlaid where we have people and where we don't have people. The east-west connections do seem a little lacking for me in residential. And specifically, you show the 537 on France as a scenario B, and that's fine. The 537 though goes to the Southdale Transit Center, which has a different type of service. And so my observation is that essentially between 98th and American and west of Penn, there is no bus service. And I think that is a pretty big gap in the system. So again, I'm not sure in your analysis where that comes in, but if you think about the 542, once you pass Penn and American heading west, other than the Wells Fargo Tower, there probably are very few riders to be picked up, and maybe a few at France and American. You're traveling all the way from France to Normandale through car dealerships and restaurants. And so, again, I understand the trying to balance access with speed, but I wonder if you might think about your 542 jogging down perhaps Penn to 84th and meeting up over at Normandale, where you're going to have an opportunity to marry both residential and work. You talk about the reverse commute people, or even people feeding the Orange Line. I mean, there is essentially nothing feeding the Orange Line in that large chunk of town. And certainly there's a fair bit of marsh. I know you observed the potential gap at 90th in France. And some of this I'm also just aware of because this is the corner of town that I happen to live in. But it just feels like that's a gap that you may want to spend some thought on, because I don't see much, probably not a lot of service happening along that chunk of American Boulevard. Otherwise, there's a lot of good stuff in here. I hope that the funding stays stable enough and the ridership rebounds enough to be able to support this and more, because I think it's what we need as a city in order to support some of the visions the Planning Commission and the City Council have.
Thank you.
All right, Commissioner Abdi?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I appreciate the presentation. Question I had, I live by the 12th and American Boulevard area, and it is one of the most diverse parts of Bloomington, which is why I love living here. But the question I had was, I know the focus and conversation today is about the routes per se, but I wanted to maybe just highlight that the public transit's shelter and benching or a seating area for this area is almost nil. I've seen folks and families who are, grocery shopping from Walmart or all these other utilizing the bus system, especially on American Boulevard. It's not a really fun process for them to utilize the public transit system, having to wait with their children in the middle of the street and sit on somebody else's grass to wait for the bus. And sometimes in the evening, there is not a proper lighting. As these routes are changing, are the facilities being considered for folks to safely wait for buses from the elements, but also from other public safety issues? I guess my question is not necessarily about the routes per se, but about should the changes be implemented and the community needs that currently exist right now in terms of the need for improved safety, facility uses, that is, shelters from the rain and snow and whatnot, and heating for the bus shelters, considering that the buses in this area I've noticed do not run as frequent as the ones I see in Minneapolis. So again, I'll just leave it at that. And I don't know if you have any response to that or not, but I would be very concerned about what we have today in this area, considering the alterations that are being made, if there are also facilities being considered. Thank you.
12th Avenue American, yeah.
So, Mr. Chair, I can maybe try to speak to that a little bit, and I know John
Absolutely.
can weigh in more on that with, but yes, we are looking at, as we make these changes, also taking a look at what changes there are in bus stops and in facilities that are required as a result of these changes. And I know that American Boulevard in particular is one area that John's been working with our engineering facilities group on. We do have a, in terms of shelters, we do have a minimum of 25 boardings per day as our threshold to justify the expense of installation and maintenance on a shelter. Heat and light become a much different story. It has a little bit to do with how far away the closest electrical connection is, but that can be, that is something that we generally need to see about 100 riders a day or so for heat and light. So that's something we can certainly take a look at. John, I don't know if you have anything specific about that particular intersection, if that's one of the ones that you've talked with, or if that's something we need to just take back.
We'll take it back, but because the D line is coming to that very part of American Boulevard, and if you're familiar, Commissioner, with the typical ABRT stations, they're standard shelters, larger shelters than the ones you usually see, and they all feature real-time signs for telling you when the bus is coming, benches, lighting, good lighting really, and heat. And all the key stops along American Boulevard from Chicago Avenue by Walmart to the east will be much upgraded by the end of, well, when the D line opens. So we actually didn't focus much on that particular area because we knew the D line was coming. But in other parts of the city, we are looking carefully at this. In point of fact, American Boulevard at Knox Avenue, the site of the new Orange Line stations now being built, have bus stops that are fine in terms of space and everything, but there's no shelter or anything at all for the crosstown buses serving that station. I've been pretty adamant actually about making sure that we do install shelters both east and westbound on American Boulevard at Knox this year. So that's a key point of our big priority is transfer points, but yes, we're reviewing locations elsewhere for shelters and bus stop locations too, to make sure they're in places where the buses can keep moving and stop safely. And we have some recommendations about shifting some bus stops on American Boulevard to do that. Some of them are in awkward locations, and we're going to look at moving them, say, beyond the intersections. And there's space all along American Boulevard to put in shelters if they're warranted, which is a good thing.
Cindy or John, this is John Solberg again, and I'm going to ask one more question, just because Commissioner Cook kind of brought it up about the express service, with the loss of our express service for the Orange Line. Just in relationship to other communities served by the Orange Line, is there Burnsville, for instance, out of the Burnsville Center, are they losing express service?
So service in Burnsville and everywhere south of the Minnesota River is not provided by Metro Transit. That's provided by MVTA, which is a separate organization with its own separate funding and its own separate planning process. So I can't really speak to what is happening in Burnsville. I guess I will say overall, in terms of, you're right, everyone would love to have a fast one-seat ride just directly from their home to their work location without any stops in between. But in order to have resources, in order to try out some of these new things, some of these improvements, we have to get those resources from somewhere. And so, that's one of the trade-offs is if we can take the resources that are currently used at a fairly minimal impact, but still a reasonable alternative for the Route 597 and reinvest those elsewhere. You're right, it is about a 5-minute longer trip, and the bus isn't nonstop, but we feel that those resources can better be deployed elsewhere where there aren't other alternatives. We can provide all-day service, improve the frequency, places like Lindale Avenue, for example.
I thank you. I appreciate that response and the difference between Burnsville and Bloomington. I see Commissioner Cookdown has additional questions or comment.
Thanks, Mr. Chair, and I apologize for asking such a specific question here, but Route 589 didn't show up anywhere on here. Has that been a victim to COVID and just isn't a thing anymore, or was it not included with this report because it doesn't affect the orange line? We still have 589 in Bloomington, which is direct service from the Normandale office park to downtown.
Right.
It's suspended.
Yeah, so it was not part of this project because it doesn't have anything to do with the orange line. But just speaking about the 589 in general, yes, John's correct. It has been suspended since COVID hit. We have a number of routes throughout the region, commuter express routes, particularly that rely on downtown as their bread and butter, that have been suspended, that we are currently working through to figure out what is the long-term plan, as we work with downtown businesses, find out as they're planning to reopen, as we look at, other areas of the region, really trying to, we know we can't keep service just suspended in a state of, in between forever. So we're starting to talk about that as well. There will be a whole separate public process, public engagement and comment period associated with any of the service that is currently suspended, that if it becomes a permanent situation.
Thank you.
Commissioner Abdi?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a point of clarification, when we say downtown, we mean downtown Minneapolis, correct?
Yes.
Thank
you. Okay. Commissioners, any further questions or comments for Cindy Harper or John Dillery? Not seeing any. Just maybe a recap again. Some concerns about loss of express service. Understand that there's resource issues, but that's still a concern from the residents in Bloomington.
Sure.
Some concern again about establishing or looking at that 542 service and its location along and in front of the auto dealers instead of maybe through some of the residential areas. I think I heard additional concerns from Commissioner Abdi about shelters, bus stop locations in that 12th Avenue location. I hope that I got that right, which is right now a loss, but future potential D-line. Am I missing anything, Commissioners?
Excellent summary.
All right. So again, next steps, Cindy or John, there's public comments available to be made on the website. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. If we go to the Metro Transit website, there is a whole project page devoted to these proposed changes. Includes a lot more detail in the report for anyone who is interested in reading up a little more about some of the background in history, as well as, kind of some of what went into this project and more details on some of the specific changes. The public comment period will close on February 22nd. And at that point is when we will really go back through all of the feedback we've received and look at what modifications we need to make to the plan. And then, of course, like I said, circle back with all of our stakeholders later on this spring. So would certainly encourage, the planning commissioners and the city in general, anything that, and we talked about this, of course, when we met with city staff, anything that you can do to help people link up to our website. We will be out in person talking, of course, from a social distance, talking with folks at places like Mall of America and South Bloomington Transit Center, 98th Street Station, a few other key locations as well. So trying to get the word out that way as well. But anything that, certainly any nudge that you can help with would be greatly appreciated.
Thank you, and of course, I would like to make sure that we extend our thanks to you and all the hard work that you guys are doing to try and keep track of ridership and destinations. It's an extremely difficult job, and we appreciate the work you're doing for us and for the public, and appreciate the presentation tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. We appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. I think that concludes item number 2 for the study session. We'll move on to item number 3, which is the pavement management program. And I believe Amy Marone, Kirk Roberts, and Paul Jarvis will be giving the information on that. And Amy, are you starting?
I am going to start us out. Let me just get a couple more things. Okay. Good evening, Planning Commission. It's been a while since I have been before you, and there's a lot of new commissioners, so thought I would start by introducing myself. And my name is Amy Marone. I am a civil engineer in our engineering department, and I work in traffic and transportation. I've been with the city for 16 years, and in my position, I have the opportunity to work on a lot of multimodal traffic issues, safe routes to school, transportation studies, transportation funding applications, and then currently I'm also working on coordination with the planning for the 494 improvements that are upcoming over the next several years. So nice to meet you all. So tonight we're going to discuss 3 spot safety improvements that we're recommending to be implemented into our 2021 PMP projects. In the past, you've seen and voted on some transportation items from the perspective of transportation system impacts from developments, but we're looking forward to bringing you some additional transportation system related items for discussion, including these issues right now. We have potentially some modifications to our alternative transportation plan that we would be looking at later this year, as well as future traffic studies. So as I said, we're going to go through 3 locations that fall within our pavement management program this year that we have had some known issues that we're going to take this opportunity to try to implement some changes with that PMP project that can help address the issues. First, we're going to look at American Boulevard West, and this is over in the Normandale Lakes District, and I'll be presenting the information on that section. Then we're going to be looking at West 86th Street through the intersection at Lindell Avenue. Kirk Roberts will be sharing information about that. And then lastly, we're going to look at West 106th Street, far on the west end of the city, where West 106th Street ends and it turns into Decatur Avenue. And Paul Jarvis will be presenting that information. So here is our map of American Boulevard. So the section that we're looking at, we have an overlay identified for this year, 2021, that goes essentially from Green Valley Drive and then to the east down to the signalized, through the signalized intersection at Norman Center Drive. And as soon as I saw this pop up on our overlay list, I knew this was going to be a good opportunity for us to address several issues that we've been hearing from residents in this area. So those issues are kind of, as this area has developed and we have a lot more residential housing on the north side of American Boulevard, we've been getting calls about concerns about pedestrian crossings on American Boulevard. So currently, it is a very long section between controlled intersections on American Boulevard. You have the traffic signal at where American Boulevard, turns and goes over Highway 100, which I'm going to call the intersection with Norman Center Drive, and then all the way to East Bush Lake Road. And there are several apartment buildings on the north side that one of the big amenities of being in this area and being a part of the district is the proximity to Normandale Lake Park, but very difficult to access it without any kind of a controlled intersection or a special crosswalk area. Another issue that we've heard through the years is concerns about speeding, and not necessarily just the fact that people are speeding. The posted speed limit is, I believe, is 30 miles an hour on this roadway, but the result of the speeding is that it's very difficult to make accurate gap selection when you're turning onto or off of the side streets along American Boulevard. And so that's another thing that we are looking to address at this time. Oh, there you go. You can see the highlighted area. And so this is the red line indicates the limits of our study, even though the overlay only goes as far as Green Valley Drive to the west. All right, so this image is just a screenshot from Google Maps. Right now, this would be facing towards Normandale Lake Boulevard, so facing to the west. Just wanted to show kind of the feel that you have out there. It's currently a 4-lane undivided roadway, 2 lanes in each direction. As you go towards the far west end, there are some median separation from Green Valley Drive down to East Bush Lake Road. The traffic volumes on this roadway are between 5,000 and 6,000 vehicles per day. And typically when we would start a study, we would go out and gather new traffic volumes. However, during COVID impacted traffic times, we have not been collecting these. Those traffic volumes, however, were collected back in 2019, and I'll talk a little bit more about why data was collected in 2019 as well. And while we are aware of numerous concerns with speeding, we don't have any documented speed data, but we do have a history of working with the police department to place temporary speed wagons out in this area and other efforts that we've done to try to improve speed limit awareness to try to impact drivers. So this is the standard process that we would use for our traffic study. Do our data collection and analysis, start to develop some proposed improvements or recommendations, do our public engagement process, which at this time, our public engagement, we've been using the City of Bloomington's new Let's Talk Bloomington site to do that. And then now we're at the point where we're coming to the Planning Commission for discussion, and there will be a public hearing for residents or residents and people who users of this area to speak on this item at the February 8th City Council meeting. And then we are hoping to have approved changes to implement into the 2021 PMP project. All right, so I wanted to talk just a little bit more about the data collection. As I mentioned, we were not able to collect data in 2020. However, back when I started receiving the concerns with the pedestrian crossings, at that time it was in early summer of 2019, and we did do some analysis at that time. So we had pretty current traffic volume counts. We also counted pedestrians at Normandale Lake Boulevard, and we had 168 pedestrians crossing in a one-day period, just crossing American Boulevard using both sides of that intersection. So that gives us a good idea of pedestrian demand as well. So the long-term plan for this area does identify a future traffic signal at the intersection of American Boulevard and Normandale Lake Boulevard. And so back in 2019, when we were looking at ways to address the pedestrian crossing safety concerns, we did do an update of the signal warrant analysis, thinking, if that traffic signal has met warrants and is going to be installed now, or, anytime within the next 5 years or so, that would be a great way to address the pedestrian crossing safety issue. However, However, the results determined that it clearly is not warranted by traffic volumes at this time. And so there was some recommendation to look at other ways to provide an enhanced crossing for pedestrians, which would include the suggestion to look at a 3-lane cross section so that we would improve pedestrian crossing safety along the entire corridor, as well as providing some space for us to build a pedestrian refuge island. All right. So from that, oh, I'm sorry. You know, one more thing I should have covered on that last slide is that the Let's Talk of Bloomington. So we did a direct mailing to the neighborhood. It was over 80 properties that are right within the project limits of this area. And so we're guiding them to the Let's Talk Bloomington site specific for this project that lays out the known issues in the area, the proposed improvements to address those issues, and provides a survey for residents to provide some feedback on the proposed changes, and also an opportunity to provide any additional information to us as city staff on any other issues that are traffic related issues that should be addressed at this time. So I can go over the results of those as I go through these 2 recommendations that are the outcome. So we're recommending striping changes on American Boulevard to address these known safety concerns. The striping changes would help to provide dedicated left turn space in the roadway, reduce the outlier speeding. It would provide a striped shoulder space for cyclists, and we also we know that there are bus routes in this area. Based on the last discussion, I'm not sure if they're currently being utilized, but we would definitely want to plan for future usage. And so the buses can also pull over into that shoulder area for bus stops. And one of the biggest things to address the specific pedestrian related issue is this provides us with enough existing curb to curb width to construct a pedestrian refuge island to address pedestrian crossing safety concerns at Normandale Lake Boulevard. So we did do some analysis of the traffic signals. We would not propose to make any changes to the striping down on the far west end at the intersection with East Bush Lake Road. So there's no impacts to the loop detection or anything. There's center medians existing, and we will look at a good location to make the merges on American Boulevard to reduce from the 4 lanes down to the 3 lanes to carry that through. We looked at the signalized intersection at Norman Center Drive, and the change in striping through that traffic signalized intersection would have very little to no impact on the operations through that signal. The main reason is that it is somewhat already, the way the drivers are using the lane layout at the intersection currently somewhat matches up with how we would be changing the striping. So the only real change is that currently there are 2 northbound through lanes. Drivers are mostly focused in one specific lane of that anyway, so there's not really a reduction in or an increase in delay at that signalized intersection at all. And by continuing the 3 lanes southbound all the way through that signalized intersection, we eliminate one more merge location needed. So that's just we try to avoid the lane merges as often as possible. Our alternative transportation plan has been referenced a couple of times tonight, but it does provide a good map and guide throughout our whole city that prioritizes routes throughout the system to provide connected bicycle networks. In the plan, American Boulevard through here is identified for proposed future facility. I think that, you know, that's a great goal, but with some upcoming projects in the future that are being planned, it's going to provide even better connections. So we've been working with Three Rivers Park District on a future CP Rail Regional Trail, which will follow along and use some existing facilities on East Bush Lake Road, but it's going to provide a great connection from our existing Highland Trail to the the 9 Mile Creek Regional Trail up in Edina. And so this would just be yet another good feed-in connection and improve that on-road bike facility network as well. Oh, I'm sorry. Jeez. All right. Okay, I'm going to go now into the recommended improvement for the pedestrian crosswalk. So this is, again, facing west at Normandale Lake Boulevard. We would be proposing to install crosswalk markings, crosswalk signage, and most importantly, a pedestrian refuge island. And so the value of adding this enhanced crosswalk to improve the experience and safety for pedestrians is it significantly improves the visibility of pedestrians. It provides pedestrian guidance. It also provides awareness to the drivers of where to anticipate pedestrians. The safety benefit of adding a pedestrian refuge island, well, first of all, the safety benefit of going from a 4-lane to a 3-lane in general is that you are significantly shortening the exposure of pedestrians. And so currently when a pedestrian wants to cross, you know, at any intersection, it's a legal crosswalk, whether it's marked or signed. But right now, under current conditions, that pedestrian is gauging traffic in 4 lanes coming from, 2 lanes in each direction. And there's a multiple threat crash risk is what it's called. So even if the first driver in the curb lane sees you and stops for you, you're still at risk of being struck by many other vehicles along your crossing distance. When you go to a 3-lane, you have you are only crossing a single lane of through traffic. You are somewhat protected in that dual left turn lane in that there is very, very little traffic traveling in that lane, and then you can cross the next through lane. Even more improvement is with a pedestrian refuge island where you're actually in a safe space waiting to make that second move. So we think that this is a good improvement that would help significantly provide some pedestrian safety in this district and at the location where we are finding is very centralized for pedestrian crossing demand. So I was going to talk a little bit more about the resident feedback that we've received so far. So we have had about 45 people visit the site to take a look at the project information. We have only received back 4 survey responses. Interestingly enough, 1 is from a resident that lives right in the district. 1 is from a commuter that does not live in Bloomington, but very likely works in this area. And then 2 additional are from residents of Bloomington that are interested in traffic throughout traffic and traffic safety throughout the city. 2 of the 4 are in support of the proposed changes to the striping, and 3 of the 4 were in support of the proposed crosswalk enhancement. So at what we're going to be asking of the Planning Commission is, since this is not a public hearing, we are still asking for discussion on each of these improvements that we're presenting, and we are looking for the Planning Commission to make a recommendation of approval to the City Council. So at this time, I can take questions on this specific item, or we can move forward with the other ones. I'll leave that up to Planning Commission's preference.
Sure. Thank you, Amy Marone. Of course, I may have some questions. So I think for myself, it would be easier to do one at a time, but I'll ask our Planning Commission members, which do you prefer? Is there a preference? Hearing none, I'll use Commissioner Cookdown. It looks like you have a thought.
Yes, Mr. Chair, it seems to make the most sense to do one at a time to keep it fresh.
Okay, perfect. All right, Ms. Marone, just if you could go back to that visual you had. I'm struggling here a little bit because my map isn't working for anything. and trying to understand, okay, so we have
This one?
yes, that'll work. So the 3-lane would be striped from Green Valley Drive, is that correct, on the west?
Chair Solberg, it is going to be approximately Green Valley Drive. So we're, that's the limits of the overlay project. We're still looking at some minor modifications that we can make to the striping a little bit to the west of that. So without having the, you know, the plan sheets in front of us, we're still kind of working through exactly what the limits of the striping changes will be.
Okay, and to the east, it's what location?
So to the east, it's essentially down to 83rd Street. So
Okay.
it would be through the signalized intersection and down to 83rd Street.
Okay, that's needed to make sure I fully understood the limits of the 3-lane, and I certainly appreciate looking at a 3-lane because, as I recall, some of the conditional use permits that have come through the area, we've had some of those same concerns. I think you were on some of those meetings as well, that there were concerns about people driving too fast and those sorts of things. My question really is not even about the 3-lane conversion, because I think that's very smart, but it might be more in the details, just so I understand. So are we using, is that a state aid road, a municipal state aid road, or is that purely a local?
This is a municipal state aid road.
It is. Okay, so you're going to have to go by state aid standards.
Yes.
Okay, and that kind of answers my question for where I was going to go without boring the rest of the Planning Commission. The next question I have is really about the pedestrian crossing. And if you go to that visual, you said that's just on the west side of Normandale Lake Boulevard. Is that what you were saying?
Yes.
Okay, and I just want to understand just a couple details on that, because I think ADA best practice would say you should provide crossings on both sides. So I want to understand why we haven't decided to do something on both sides of the road, because it does look like there's sidewalk available on both the east and west side of Norman Lake Boulevard. And then really the second is probably too detailed, but what is the width of that pedestrian refuge? Is it sufficient enough to think about, say, a bicycle and a burley, or is it really in that 4-foot width that is kind of typical to provide refuge so that signs aren't hit?
Chair Solberg, those are excellent questions. So given that this is a state aid roadway, our minimum width for a pedestrian refuge island is 8 feet. And so we will be at that 8 feet in our design. Okay. We are also taking a look at constructing this in a way that if in the future we felt that RRFB, that rectangular rapid flashing beacon supplements were needed, that we would be able to add those or that type of signage into this existing cross section. A little bit more detailed is your question about why we're not providing a crossing also on the west side of the intersection. I believe there are ped ramps in place, and there will continue to be ped ramps in place. So there would still be a legal crosswalk provided on that side. One issue that we run into is because the big driveway to the full development on the north is on a curve, it has a big sweeping entrance. And we were getting into having to do some pretty significant modifications to that driveway opening if we wanted to have the crosswalk be anywhere near the actual intersection. We think that this was the side that had the most crossings happening currently. This is the side that has the bus stop currently, even though we know that those can be moved if needed. We felt that this was the best side of the intersection to provide visibility. As you're coming from the west, there is a little bit of a curve. It seems a lot more open when you're out there, when you're approaching from the west, from the east, even though it's the same curve. So from a sight line visibility and serving the most pedestrians, we feel that this is the best spot to place the pedestrian refuge island portion of the crosswalk.
Okay, so we're still providing the legal ADA crossing on both sides. It's just this side is the refuge. Okay, just wanted to understand that a little bit. And I know I'm probably going to think about this a little bit again too much, but thinking about that big sweeping, that radius on that curve going north, is there any thought, now is that different material? Is that bituminous versus concrete, or are they both the same? Because we've come across this in my work too, and some of the recommendations are changing pavement colors to make the driver that's traveling through see that is a narrower location. But for the trucks and that might need that curve, it provides the opportunity to make it without crossing the curb or the boulevard. So I'll just leave that as a comment, and that's nothing more to respond to. So any other comments from commissioners? Otherwise, I am supportive of this. So commissioners? I see a thumbs up from Commissioner Roman. Thumbs up from Commissioner Albrecht. You can talk. It's allowed. Commissioner Abdi is a thumbs up as well. Commissioner Cookton, did you have anything? Thumbs up. Okay, we're moving on.
He had two thumbs up. That's been really good.
Ooh, yeah, it is really good then.
That's great. Thank you. Okay, now I'm going to hand it over to Kirk Roberts. I'll still be controlling the slides, so please excuse if Kirk has to keep telling me next slide. So.
Commissioners, good evening. I'm Kirk Roberts, Traffic and Transportation Engineer for the city, and I hope you can hear me at this point.
We sure can, Kirk.
All right. Thanks for having me. I've been at the city for 10 years, and I manage the traffic and transportation projects in Bloomington. The one I want to talk to you about tonight is on the 86th Street corridor. This is a pretty significant east-west collector street in the city. I'm showing it here in red. It also forms a very key bike route, east-west bike route across the city, which extends from Old Shakopee Road on the east side, and it connects eventually down to Xerxes, shown here in blue, and makes its way all the way to the west side of Bloomington. The intersection I want to focus in specifically is 86th Street, and that's shown here with a red star. I'm seeking some changes. I'm looking for the commission's support on those. And then the next slide here, similar to the presentation Amy just gave on American Boulevard, in 2010, Amy led a study on 86th Street to convert that from from its existing 4-lane configuration to the 3-lane configuration that's there now. That also includes bike lanes on the side. And that was a pretty extensive study, including the public process. When that work was done in 2010, there was quite a bit of concern about car traffic along 86th Street incurring additional delay under the new lane configuration. That's something that came up again and again. And that was especially true at the signalized intersections, the main one being Lyndale Avenue. And for some context, because I'm imagining this will be asked as well, traffic volumes on Lyndale right there at 86th Street are about 15,000 cars a day. And east-west volumes are a bit over 7,000 cars a day. So collectively, between all legs, that intersection sees about 22,000 cars a day. And so it's significant. And there were a lot of concerns that if you reduce this down to a single lane, you're going to inflict delay on drivers. And because of that, it was decided to leave the east-west approaches to Lyndale Avenue in their current 4-lane configuration. So Amy, if you want to move to the next slide here. So the way that was done was essentially we ended the bike lanes a couple hundred feet in advance of the intersection and brought back the 4-lane configuration so cars would have space to queue. And then the next slide here is just showing the queuing. It allows those multiple lanes for vehicles to wait for the signal to turn green. The notable thing about this is that rightmost lane is not highly utilized because it merges a couple hundred feet on the other side of the intersection. Drivers tend to not want to be in there. In fact, the state DOT has studied this, and for about every 3 cars in the main lane, you'll get 1 car in that right curb lane. And so it's not well utilized. And so that's just a bit of trivia you can impose on your friends at the next party there. So after the road was converted in 2010, Bob Simons, who leads our infrastructure group, came through and rebuilt the pavement on Lyndale Avenue over to the east. And as part of that, he and his folks rebuilt the intersection. They added a new traffic signal cabinet, which allows us to sort of control the intersection remotely as well as control it much more efficiently. It's a new and updated control system. We also replaced the protected arrows out there for the left turns with the standard flashing yellow indications that you're also probably seeing more and more in the metro now and getting familiar with. That makes the intersection operate much more effectively than it ever has in the past. After that, we established direct communication and we implemented a series of timing plans that respond better to traffic throughout the day. And so the intersection is operating much more efficiently than it was in 2010 or any time in the past. So because of that, and up in the summer coming up here, Bob Simons and his crew again are going to come out here and rehab the pavement on the west side of the roadway. The top slide is what you saw a minute ago, the existing lane configuration. The bottom slide is some striping changes I'd like to make. Instead of maintaining the through 2 lanes in each direction, we'd like to maintain a single lane plus the dedicated left turn that you see now, and add that continuous bike lane across the intersection. We've modeled what that change would do to traffic, and essentially it gives you a little bit longer queue of vehicles. And this drawing is not to scale. It's not to say that there's always going to be that many vehicles waiting at the light. That varies broadly throughout the day, but it's just to show you that instead of having these 2 lanes to queue in, you'd have a single lane for cars to queue in. But the significant takeaways here is there's no real additional delay added to the intersection. There's no change in the level of service. And for those of you that don't think transportation too much, level of service is just a qualitative measure of delay. It goes from A, which is almost no delay, it would be like 10 seconds, to F, which is 80 seconds of delay, very bad, people frustrated, horns honking, and general chaos. What's the changes that we're proposing would really not change that delay at all. And then the most important takeaway is that under this new configuration, the cars would clear with the onset of green. So you're not going to have cars come up to the intersection, get a green light, everybody in front of them goes, oh, they got a red, they have to wait through the next cycle. Everybody clears in the same queue. And we're able to maintain that into the future. We looked at this in terms of growth using growth rates that we don't expect to see, much heavier growth than we expect to see in this area. And it operates well into the 20-year horizon without issues. And the analysis we did is based on pre-COVID traffic volumes too, which are higher than what we're seeing now. So it's a very conservative analysis from that perspective. And we can maintain the timing into the future. Like I say, we can actually change the timing remotely now. We monitor these intersections much more frequently than we have in the past. And actually, I can change the timing from the comfort of my home if I chose to. So we're in a pretty good position to operate it. So in summary, the proposed restriping creates a continuous lane for cyclists. We then don't have to share a lane and queue up in the same space with vehicle traffic. It does so without adding any significant delay to drivers or motorists. So the proposed accommodation, it accommodates a broader range of users efficiently with better safety, and it represents therefore a better, higher utilization of the public roadway. And so commissioners, it's a relatively small change, but it's an important one. For some context, when Amy looked at this corridor back in 2010, both the Planning Commission and the Council were looking to provide meaningful accommodation for cyclists. But there was a lot of concern about encumbering other users, auto traffic, and both bodies weighed in on that point. And the striping that you see now reflects those concerns. Since that time, the city's continued to improve its infrastructure. We've continued to invest in the community. Because of that, we can continue to advance our accommodations for all roadway users. And consistent with the concerns expressed by the Commission and the Council in 2010, we can do that without significantly encumbering anybody, any of the other users. So that's reflected in the striping changes, and I'm seeking the support of the Commission to take these to the Council. And I'm happy to answer questions.
All right, thank you, Kirk Roberts. Any commission members? Commissioner Abdi.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm in support of both presentations made today. I appreciate staff's time on that. A question I had is really not per se. It's focused on the 86th and Lindale corridor area, but it's not specifically about this. I just wanted to tie any changes in transit. I know this is mostly a striping modification and not necessarily a reconstructing of that intersection, so to say. But with the Lindale retrofit plan that the city is considering, I know the plan that you mentioned right now, the 2010, plan that you mentioned was something that was already done that you're building onto for this proposal to kind of show that we are making the improvements we've heard being a need at the time. Would there be any changes to the streets? Are there any proposed changes to the streets that would link with the Lindale retrofit that's being discussed right now at the city? And maybe that may not sound a bit clear, but I'm trying to tie what we're talking about right now with the proposed changes that are going to be coming to Lindale, especially 86th and Lindale and 98th and Lindale that we are still trying to talk through. And I'm trying to tie that with transit changes today. And I know things in the land use component takes forever to come to fruition, but I appreciate the changes that you're doing today to accommodate today's needs. But I was trying to make a connection between the two plans. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Commissioner Abdi, I appreciate that question and shows a lot of forethought. The Lindale retrofit does propose increased levels of density, much more housing in the area, revitalization of the area, and that would come with additional traffic, and that would be added to Lindale. And so potentially that could affect how we operate this intersection, but I don't think it would be enough or of the magnitude that we would reverse this decision on how we approach those side streets. In fact, I think it would lend support to restriping those side streets because we want that Lindale corridor to be very multimodal, very bike friendly, so we can reduce the number of people that are driving those cars and the need for roadway modifications. The one caveat is there is some thought about adding multimodal facilities to Lindale, and changes in the capacity of Lindale could affect this intersection, but we don't know enough about that yet that I can really make a statement on what the changes would look like. We're just still developing our thoughts about how we could rework the Lindale corridor to accommodate bikes better. So I don't have anything real specific. I think what we're proposing to do now would work very well into the future, regardless of what happens on Lindale, even with all the revitalization that the city's hoping for and envisioning out there. I think it would still work. And then you just alluded to transit. Well, let me back up. One other point on the Lindale corridor retrofit is that with that plan is a whole nother set of roads and streets, driveways and things to serve those additional developments. So there would be additional transportation infrastructure built with that to handle some of the increased trips and things like that. And that, again, I can't speak specifically to all the impacts because we haven't looked at it in that level of detail as of yet, but we will. And then transit, this doesn't have any effect on transit. There wouldn't be additional delay or anything like that to transit on 86th Street. That is a well-served corridor from the transit perspective, and we don't want to do anything that detracts from that. So I hope that I answered your questions.
All right, Commissioner Abdi, was that good or?
It was perfect. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you. Commissioner Roman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I am very supportive of this change. I travel this route frequently in the east-west And I think the reason, especially that I think it works, is the intentional for westbound traffic, the intentional turn lane right there at Aldrich, because Mr. Roberts, I know you said that for every 3 cars that choose the left lane, 1 car chooses the right lane. Well, what happens is you choose the right lane because you're afraid of having to stop while someone's waiting to turn left, and then if they don't stop, you run into this quick bottleneck trying to merge. So I think that's a well planned out design. So I'm very supportive of it. If I could take a moment of a little bit of a related but side point of personal privilege, 86 is a pretty reasonable thoroughfare for the city, and I think this conversion to this model has worked well. What I noticed though is, and you kind of alluded to it with your drawing that shows the bike connection that continues Xerxes to 90th and so on. What happens when you get a thoroughfare like this and you get to somewhere like Xerxes? It's not clear to most drivers that thoroughfare kind of isn't meant to continue on. You continue maybe another block and then you are dumped into what should be low traffic residential. And there's speed and traffic issues and line of sight issues once you reach that dead end on Zenith there. And so I'm not necessarily looking for an answer of how you solve it. I just don't know what we do generally as the city when we run into things where what's intended to be a thoroughfare kind of needs to go one way or the other and not continue straight on.
All right. Commissioner Crookton.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Not directly related to this item, but I did notice when the photos were shown at 86 in Lindale and the renovation that happened the last time this was done in, I think it was 2010, it did stick out to me that I don't know if they were new or just retained, but the curb walks, the sidewalks that are right next to the street are still there. And I recognize that's not the exact item we're talking about here, but just for my own knowledge, because I don't know this, what relation do sidewalks have to do with our pavement management program? Is that included in that, or do we rely on private development to modify those sidewalks, or how does that all get mixed together? So I hope we can continue to remove and replace these curb walks with more pedestrian-friendly sidewalks away from the street.
Mr. Chairman, Commissioner Cookton, and the city engineer is also on the line, and she can speak to this more if I don't satisfy your question. They do sidewalk repairs as part of PMP work, but it's fairly limited to that. And so under a pavement management project, we wouldn't move an entire sidewalk to get it away from that curb, although I would love it if we did. I agree that the curb walk is less than desirable now, but that said, the funding for sidewalks, as much as they are loved, the sidewalk funding is actually fairly limited, and so we're just limited to where we can get development to pay for those, or where we have special projects to add them, grant funding and things like that to pay for that. Just the one though plug for some of the work that Amy's doing, the 3-lane cross section makes walking on those curb walks an awful lot nicer as an experience, because you do now have that 5 or 6 foot buffer between you and traffic when you're on those sidewalks. So yeah, it does have a net benefit to pedestrians as well.
Thank you for that response. And anything I can do as an individual planning commissioner to throw some weight behind getting funding moved around to get rid of those curb walks, I'm happy to do that. I think they, particularly in some locations, Old Shakopee Road, et cetera, they're downright terrible. It would be great to see those get replaced with more pedestrian safe sidewalks.
I hope our county commissioners were listening to that. Commissioner Cookton, any additional comments on this one?
No, thanks, Mr. Chair. I'm in support.
Okay. I'll just announce I'm in support of it. I do have a question for you, Mr. Roberts, though, and it really has to do about safety bicyclists and these sorts of improvements where we have what was once a 4-lane, and it kind of splits off like this. And I'm looking at your I guess, schematic, and I'm wondering, are we doing anything more than just that kind of striping, or are we treating that bike lane differently? We've seen that in other communities where it's painted to really help it stand out. Because my concern here is as you're driving towards that, and I see this oftentimes, is people will drive across that bike lane to avoid the queue in some of these longer setups to get to that right turn lane. So I'm just wondering, what are the tricks within engineering that help really provide the visual barrier for automobiles?
Mr. Chairman, I appreciate that. That's a design level question that we're sorting through right now. And so this is just a preliminary concept. We don't have the design sorted out. In terms of, though, you're right that whenever you cross a bike lane over a right turn lane, you get into significant issues, and you want drivers to understand that that is a space where they can expect to see those cyclists. And so we use a series of, we can use wider lines, we can use different types of lines, all the way up to, as you alluded to, painting that lane green. Now, we haven't done that yet in the city. It's something we've looked at in a couple instances, and we've made the decision to use other treatments instead, but that's certainly an option that we reserve. And those ideas, those standards are rapidly evolving, so that every year when we look through these facilities, we've got to go, okay, well, what's the latest thing that we can do now? It's a nice place to be in, that we do have so many more tools at our disposal to keep cyclists and pedestrians safe on the road like this. So I don't have specific answers to your question, but it's something we're sorting through right now, and we do intend to use what's needed there.
Typically, though, right now in the city of Bloomington, it's simple striping and marking in that location.
That's correct, Mr. Chairman, and including the bike lane markings. That's something that we've heard about from people, especially on 86th Street, is that we don't mark our bike lanes. In 2010, we actually couldn't mark those as a bike lane because of the state aid standards that you alluded to earlier. Now those have changed, and we do have more tools at our disposal, and we're starting to go back through and restriping those as bike lanes in specific facilities.
All right, thank you. So I think I saw, as I read the commission, everybody is in support of the restriping at 86th and Lyndale. Anything else we need on that one, Mr. Roberts?
I'm set. Thank you, commissioners. Appreciate your time.
Thank you. All right, and I think Paul Jarvis, you're up next.
Good evening, commissioners. I'm Paul Jarvis. I'm the traffic management coordinator. I work in engineering. I work for both Amy and Kirk. I primarily handle the city's traffic calming requests and work on bike and pedestrian projects. And I've been with the city for just short of 14 years. The third project we're looking at tonight here is an intersection improvement at 106th and Decatur. A little reference, we're on the far west side of Bloomington. On the left there is 169. We're just north of Old Shakopee. For the most part, the area is primarily single-family residents and some multifamily townhouses that are along Decatur. This is City Park. Land is on the south side, Cavell Pond. The frame and the reason for the project, the short answer is we've been having too many accidents occurring at this residential intersection. We average about one accident per year. That may not seem like a lot, but the severity of the accidents, whether personal or property damage, has been rather high. All the accidents have been vehicles leaving the roadway, ending up on, or in a couple of cases, in private property. The contributing factors we look at on this one is mostly a speeding problem. 106th Street between Bloomington Ferry and is about 3/4 of a mile long with no traffic control or very few driveways too. We've attempted in the past to control the speeding on this segment of 106 with some temporary radar feedback signs. That did have some success in lowering average speeds closer to the posted 30 mile an hour, but the radar signs work only for a limited time and their effectiveness tends to wane, especially in these neighborhoods where it's just primarily the residents. And we've made other improvements along at this intersection as well in the past. We've added some curve warning signs, added and improved the overhead street lighting in this area. You go to the next slide. You go. Yeah, the 2021 overlay project gives us the opportunity to make some further changes to help alleviate the problem. We're looking at proposing two concrete medians at the entrances to both the curve on the north and the east side. The kind of the lower left-hand corner of the slide shows kind of an example of what the medians are going to look like. The primary goal is to narrow down the roadway, the lane width of approaching, coming up to this curve. We call it an intersection, but really it's a curve between a collector roadway, 106th Street, and a primary residential roadway of Decatur. By putting in the concrete medians, we give visual cues to slow down and that you're entering or you're making a change in the actual roadway use, going from its collector to a residential. And we can also look at these medians as a bit of a gateway treatment that gives the drivers the idea that we're no longer on a 4-lane or wider roadway, going as more of a gateway residential treatment. The ADTs in this area, we don't have any current data, but we've got some in the past couple of years. Right at this intersection, there's about 500 cars a day. And that's about what I have. Can you go to the next slide? And I can take questions. It's a pretty simple project.
All right. Commission members, any questions for Mr. Jarvis on this? Mr. Jarvis, I'll just ask the question. What's the width of the road there, and then what will be the width of the lanes with the concrete medians?
Currently, it's a 36-foot wide roadway, and with the medians, we'll bring it down to 12 or 13-foot drive lanes on both sides.
Okay, and the extent, I'm assuming you probably don't have the details yet other than maybe the width, but the length, that'll be determined by future design, is that correct?
Yep, we'll be going into final design soon.
Okay, and then as I see understand this schematic in front of us, then it looks like it includes striping to help I guess delineate
we'll be adding striping.
throughout.
We'll be adding striping between the two concrete medians, Mr. Chair.
What would be the next step if this doesn't reduce crashes in the corner?
Would be I think would have to be some sort of redesign of the interchange itself.
Okay, all right. So this is the low-cost option to address driver behavior.
Yes, sir.
All right, thank you. Commissioner Albrecht.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just have some questions about parking, and I may have missed this, so apologies if you already mentioned it, but looking at the Google Earth image or apps version, and I see parking along the street, is that allowed? And then follow-up question to that would be, then does that become not allowed when you have the median put in?
Commissioner Albrecht, currently there's no parking on 106th Street allowed, and I think there's around the curve, I don't think there's parking allowed as well but there's some parking up on Decatur. I don't think this would change much. I think there'd still be room to park.
Any additional questions, Commissioner Albrecht? No?
No, thanks. That was helpful.
Okay. Any others? Any other commission members? I'll start. I'll say, yeah, I support the option to put in the medians here at this corner. It looks like just that narrowing of the lanes is helpful in reducing speeds. Feels like, unfortunately, one of these roads, and I'll put my 2 cents out there again, that are often overbuilt within many cities, and we can benefit from reduced pavement widths for sustainability and public health for using for other ways. So I think this is just one way to start to address some of those issues. So support it and move it forward. Other commission members, can is there support? Commissioner Albrecht is a thumbs up. I'm not necessarily seeing the others, so you'll have to, Commissioner Cookdon's a thumbs up.
Support.
And Commissioner Abdi is in support. All right, Mr. Jarvis, it looks like you have a recommendation of support to move those forward.
Thank you. Have a good evening.
All right, thank you. Thank you all to the Public Works staff for your work on these. Appreciate you listening to the public and hearing their concerns and moving forward multimodal improvements throughout the city. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, let's see. We are now on item number 4 for the evening, and I guess I'm going to look to Mr. Markegard to continue our discussion of Planning Commission meeting format.
I have to unmute, Mr. Chairman, commissioners. Good evening. We had some discussion at your last meeting 1 week ago, study discussion, and the commission decided to make a couple changes to your meeting format. First of all, televising study meetings. We were able to do that, working with communication staff, able to do that immediately. And so tonight we are televised in our study session. And then the commission adopted an 11 p.m. Deadline. I don't think we'll hit that tonight. But there was one item that the commission wanted to carry over for more discussion, and that was whether or not to convert study meetings to regular meetings. Again, the commission hears study items both at study meetings and at regular meetings. Tonight is a regular meeting, and we've had 3 study items, so that's certainly possible to do. We do have 9 meetings per year that are set aside specifically for study items. And the idea is that you can go more in depth at those meetings. But based on past planning commission preference, what we've tried to do is, where possible, have the study items be on regular agendas. And the reason for that was to reduce the overall number of meetings. So in a given year, I'm guessing about half of the study meetings, if not a little bit more, are canceled. So while there are 9 on the schedule, typically they're not all used. It might be 4 that are actually used. So kind of the policy trade-off is, would you like more meetings but shorter meetings, or fewer meetings but longer meetings? And there are both pros and cons on that. From a staff perspective, one of the issues is that there are some staff time impacts in having additional meetings. There's some overhead that goes into having additional meetings. Certainly for communication staff, there are costs. For planning staff, there are costs as well that go into that, creating a packet. We have staff that have minimum callback periods that attend the meetings, and generally it's more efficient to have fewer meetings but longer meetings, but we can certainly accommodate if the commission does want to convert study meetings to regular meetings. So just wanted to open that up for discussion and get your input. If you do decide you want to make a change, we would need a motion on that, and we would formally change the schedule that we have posted online.
All right, thank you, Mr. Markegard. I did, as chair, I did review the discussion from the last meeting, so I'm aware of what was going on during that meeting, but I'm going to let those that were in attendance begin the discussion. So, Commissioner Cookton.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was initially somewhat 50-50 on it. I liked the idea of converting our study meetings to regular meetings to to sort of having more meetings, but shorter meetings makes it a little easier to prepare for us. Sometimes long meetings or very loaded meetings can be a lot to prepare for. When we get a packet on Friday or Thursday and we have a week to prepare, that can be a bit a lot. And so having that spread over more meetings could lessen the burden on us and give us more time to focus on individual items. So I do like that aspect of it, but what I think I've trended towards as I've thought about it more is that although there is that benefit of slightly less study time, I think there's also a reverse effect of having to go to more meetings. You now have to travel to City Hall more often to attend a shorter meeting. And I'm not sure I'm saving much personal time by having to go to more meetings than if I had just studied a little bit longer for one meeting. And so I think what I've trended towards is I would like to keep, my preference would be to keep the study meetings the way they are. And I had another thought that I'm sure will come back to me.
Okay. Thank you, Commissioner Cookton, and we'll get back to you. I think I got Commissioner Albrecht.
Thanks. I also have been thinking about this and agree with Commissioner Cookton that I think it allows for the opportunities to cancel meetings if there isn't anything on the study items, which allows us Thursday nights back versus taking even a couple hours. I think I would be in preference to have more time to study if need be. So
you're in support of keeping it as is, correct?
Yes, thanks.
Okay, all right. Commissioner Cookton, you must have found your other thought.
I do, but I don't need to cut back in line if other folks are.
Normally in a study we just talked, so go ahead, and then we'll come back to Commissioner Abdi.
The other reason I persuaded myself to have this opinion is that we've also sort of decided that we're going to put this end time on meetings, which also could help us limit the very long meetings. So that's sort of a conduit for that. And I think most of our meetings are in, the 2 to 3 hour range. And I think I would rather have 1 3-hour meeting than 2 1.5-hour meetings. I think that's still reasonable. And we've got this now sort of idea that we're going to limit the 5 or 6 hour meetings. So for all of those reasons combined, I'm comfortable keeping the study sessions as is.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Commissioner Abdi?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm actually in favor of the combination of the meetings. It would only be a couple of hours. And should an item go beyond a certain time and members are not willing to extend it, an item can be continued to a different meeting. Is that correct, Mr. Chair?
Yes, that would be correct. I think the other benefit of making all meetings public hearing is it does allow more meetings to which then continuances could be made.
Yeah, and another thing, based on my understanding from the last time we talked about this, was study sessions are not made public. So should we combine everything, I think it would be beneficial for the public to be informed of the conversations that we're having in these somewhat closed doors, considering that some of these are not recorded. And I don't know if this will be publicized or not. But so that we're all open about when the commissioners are referencing something that we've discussed in the study session, that somebody may not be aware about it, that when combined, the meetings, they could hear about it as a study session if it's open to the public. Then at a different meeting, they can realize the relationship that commissioners are talking about the 2 different items. So I'm in favor of it. And yeah, I don't have anything completely against it if it continues to be the way it is, but I would prefer it to be combined.
Okay, so to maybe summarize, you're in support of combining the meetings. One, part of that is really the transparency of having the study meetings publicly broadcast, and then the ability to, and if I got it right, the second one is being able to, with the limited time, to continue to short duration for those items, rather than
That is correct.
missing the study session time frame. That was wordy, but I think I got where you were coming from.
And Mr. Chairman, if I could just make one comment.
Yep.
I want to note that all meetings are
public
and open to the public, and whether they're study or regular, and all would be televised as well.
Okay. All right. So, okay. All right. Commissioner Roman?
Yeah, those of you who were here last time know I'm an advocate for consolidating them and just having meetings, not separating them. I don't think it's an idea. We're not necessarily having more meetings, because we could cancel a regular meeting just as easily as we could cancel a study meeting. It's about how the staff plans and brings us an agenda that they feel captures the needs of the business that needs to be done. I know for myself, and Nellie and Joanne aren't here, so I'm not going to speak for them and their take, but I know Nellie was clear about long days. I know for me, about a half hour ago, I was kind of reaching my limit for the day, and that was only 2.5 hours. And so I would personally prefer to meet, if we have to meet, more and have them be shorter. But I think the idea of having the ability for the staff to create an agenda that is the business that needs to be done, regardless of whether it's hearing related business or study business. Again, I believe they have the ability to cancel meetings regardless of what the calendar is. So, and I think it's also valuable for us. We had the 11 o'clock time cutoff to try to line up with the council. Now we've always started at 6. Now the council starting at 6. We are kind of the next big body after the city council. So given that they've gone to all standard meetings, I personally would be in favor of aligning the business in a similar fashion. But that's my take.
Okay. All right. So I think we got everybody. I have not given my thoughts yet. And I think one of the things I think about with this is we have not had a lot of meetings that have gone late, but we've had more meetings go really late in the last 6 months, year, than in my 4 previous years. And so there certainly has been their fair share of long meetings. And I think the side of that is that the public and the applicants deserve to be heard and have a good discussion about their applications. On the other side, I fully agree with the council that in another level of transparency, to provide meetings that are open to the public in a time in which they're awake, rather than going to wee hours of the morning or late hours of the night, is beneficial. So when I think about those, and this trend, and maybe it's a blip on the radar, maybe it's not, of having these meetings, these longer meetings in this last year, and the kind of the maneuvering we were trying to do to fit in the opportunity or the pandemic housing ordinance, and to try and make it in a quick timeline for some of these to be useful. I like the idea of combining the meetings simply with the ability to, instead of waiting, in some cases 2+ or 3+ weeks or better in order to get it back in line, that we have shorter distance between those meetings, or shorter timelines. And that just kind of goes to what part of the public expect from us in the process. Really, as far as the number of meetings, I'm going to say honestly, I don't plan on anything on Thursday evenings, because I never know if we're going to quite have a study session or we're not. And so, again, I think you come back to allowing these additional dates for the planning staff to really try and figure out what schedules are. I know we've asked it in the past, what planning commissioners, are going to be here in July or summer if there's really a lot of things going on, so that they can tailor some of the schedule to that. And I think as we get into some of these other months and the items get lower, we may still cancel a regular meeting, much like we did a study session. So that's my thoughts. We can absolutely continue the discussion. So, Commissioner Cookton?
Mr. Markgard, when a private developer has an application that they want to put before us, how is it determined what meeting that goes on? Is that a city decision, or does the applicant get to pick the date they want?
Mr. Markgard?
Sure. Mr. Chairman, Commissioner Cookton, generally they are placed on the next available meeting, which that happens, I'd say 98% of the time. Occasionally we run into a situation where we have a very large number of items on a given agenda. And in that case, and this happens rarely, but in that case, we would kind of handle it first come, first served. And when it fills up, we would take the additional items and shift them to a future meeting. But that's very rare.
Does that answer where you're going, Commissioner Cookton?
It does, and I think where I was sort of going with that is I think it gives, if that is sort of the standard procedures, it probably gives us a little bit less flexibility to cancel a regular meeting than a study meeting, where the study meeting is in our control. And, it's sort of our call if we think we can sort of slam down on the back end of a regular meeting, whereas an applicant has the expectation that they're going to be at the next meeting. I could see a situation where we're seeing more one-item meetings than we are now.
Sure. Okay. Yeah, and I think just to be clear too, and the status of meetings really depends upon the 60-day law. So they have to be in that time frame for a decision. So it's not like we get to just push them out forever because we don't want to have a public meeting. So other thoughts on this?
Yeah, I was just saying what's hard about that is that the items are so unpredictable as to how long they're going to take. Let's say we only had one item of public business or of hearing related business tonight. The first item, the applicant spoke for, 30 seconds. Yeah. And we spent an hour on that item. So even items that are pretty straightforward without, long oratories from the applicant can still chew up a fair bit of time. But I think to your point, Commissioner Cookton, is how much does the staff have the ability to, what we always have done is put it on the next agenda, but does the staff have the ability to choose to wait another week if they realize that there's only one item and we only think there's one item the week after? I don't know what the right answer is, but it's just more about if the staff has the ability to determine that versus past practice, which is we just put it on the next one because we only meet twice a month.
Yeah,
Mr. Markgard?
Mr. Chairman, Commissioner Roman, we've tried that actually fairly frequently when we have just one small item on an agenda. We'll talk to the applicant and say, would you have any concerns about shifting back 2 weeks? And every once in a while they'll say, okay, but I'd say 90% of the time, no, time is money. So they'd very much prefer not to shift unless we mandate it. So once we have a schedule out that says these are the meeting dates, there's an expectation that unless the agenda is full, that they would be able to utilize that date.
Commissioner Cookton, you still got your hand up, or just go ahead and talk if you need to?
That is a new hand. And I know this is a little bit of a detour in the conversation, but I think it's still part of the conversation. Now that we are moving forward with making all of our study meetings, whether they're separate or combined, public and televised, are we going to consider sort of cranking up the formality of those again? I know our study sessions tend to be a little bit relaxed. Now that they're being televised, are we going to consider sticking with this similar formality that we use for our regular meetings? And I guess that's not a question to anyone in particular, but maybe just
a good question.
Yeah, I think that's. Well, I would put it this way. Right now, and I would say especially during COVID, you're seeing these even much more formal than they have been in the past when we were in person. I guess, Mr. Markegard, if we're going to televise those, we will all be in here instead of around a table. And I guess that's almost a television, the communications folks, about how they would be able to track on each person speaking.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, Commissioner Cookton, I think that the biggest issue on formality will be the setting. Like you said, when we're televised, we need to be in the chambers because that's where we have everything set up to accommodate that. So study meetings have always been open to the public, and the public frequently attends study meetings, but we've been having study meetings in a conference room setting, kind of everybody sitting around a table. It's a lot more, like you said, relaxed and formal. So I think that will change a bit being televised, but that's a trade-off for the transparency.
Right. Okay. So I guess to your side, Commissioner Cookton, for me, in my experience, they're going to be much more formal than they used to be. And I think we have the ability to still figure out what that means if we're in the chambers. And will that require the chair to call on people as they speak so that the camera knows who to go to versus kind of open discussion? I think that's probably more of a logistics question. All right. Any other thoughts? So we got kind of right now, I think I'm reading the room as Commissioner Cookton would prefer to stay as is. Commissioner Albrecht would prefer to stay as is. Commissioner Abdi is leaning towards combination, and I think Commissioner Roman and I are on the side of combining the meetings. So we're kind of in this middle ground, and we don't have two of our commissioners. And I really do think, I hate to say this, but I would not like to make a decision without two of the commissioners really being able to be heard, at least for the decision to make a resolution. If that's okay with commission members, if we can continue the discussion until our next available. It's not pressing, not something that we need a recommendation on now, but I'll take the temperature of the commission. Commissioner Albrecht.
Do we remember, I mean, I kind of remember that Commissioner Goldsman was on the side of going towards combining the meetings. Potentially Commissioner Corman was also, I'm not wedded to really anything. I almost would rather make a decision about this and kind of move on rather than belabor it and think of it too complicated. I'm in no matter what. Sign me up.
Okay.
That's my opinion.
That, Commissioner Albrecht. Yeah, I don't recall the I read some of the comments.
I have some notes. Sorry, we just talked about being more formal, and then I jump in.
Go ahead.
I don't know that Commissioner Goldsman was necessarily strongly an advocate for combining. she was strongly an advocate for having the meeting length be more predictable, which I suppose then may lead you toward more meetings. Commissioner Corman, I think, was definitely in for more meetings because she wanted shorter meetings. But I don't want to speak for that. That's just what my notes say that I have. But I think it's funny because we're in the same situation we were last time. I was filling in the chair and I said, we should really wait because we should have everybody weigh in on it. So here we are.
Well, I'm glad we're all very considerate of each other on the plan.
I would agree, though, with the chair's position that this isn't urgent, and we don't necessarily have to discuss it ad nauseum next time. But I would also agree with having the collective together to make a big change to how the body operates.
Well, I would this is a way to kind of move us forward. Our next meeting is February 11th. And how many items do we have on the February 11th meeting, Mr. Markegard?
Yeah, good question. I'm not remembering many. And let's actually check in with Ms. O'Day.
Oh, okay.
Ms. O'Day, I'm going to unmute you.
I think I just saw 2.
Yeah, there's I have a simple CUP and then
Well, don't say simple. Don't do that to us.
I think it's the comp plan amendment. Glenn, does that sound familiar?
That does sound familiar.
Okay. But those I think it's only 2.
It's probably a 30 to 60 minute item, I would guess.
Everything's a 30 to 60 minute item. All right. I would propose this. If we have an understanding now where everybody's heard the item, that if we can continue as a last item on the February 11th meeting, we can settle it then. The study meeting, there's not a study meeting until the 18th, so it's not like we're getting rid of anything right there. And then that would give, as a resolution, we would perform that. How long will it take to be put in effect then, Mr. Markegard?
Mr. Chairman, Commissioners, I don't think you'd need a resolution. But
sorry.
We would need a motion.
Motion.
And it looks like the February 18th study meeting's already been canceled, so it would probably take effect in March. So that mid-March meeting would be the first study meeting that would become a regular meeting.
And that really, so there you have it, folks. We don't have a study meeting in February regardless, so I would propose that we just hold this over until the 11th, or we get a email from those 2 commissioners if they're not planning on being here. That way we at least have a document saying where everybody stands. Can we be supportive of that? Thumbs up from Commissioner Roman, Commissioner Cookton, Commissioner Albrecht, Commissioner Abdi. I can't necessarily see you, but I'm going to...
Yes, I'm in support.
That's a yes. Okay. All right. So we have agreement on that. We will see if we can reach out, maybe verbally to the commissioners or via email to provide you with that information, Mr. Markegard, to potentially shorten that discussion on the 11th.
Sounds good. And Mr. Chairman, I would recommend a motion to continue.
Absolutely. Commission members, do I have a motion to continue this item until the February 11th meeting? Commissioner Cookton?
I move to continue this item to February, is it 11th?
Yes, February 11th.
February 11th, 2021.
All right, Commissioner Abdi?
Second.
All right, we have a motion and a second to move the item before us to the February 11th regular Planning Commission meeting. Seeing no further discussion, all those in favor say aye by roll call. Commissioner Cookton? Sorry, I'm going out of order. I don't have my paperwork anymore.
Aye. I to go first.
Commissioner Abdi.
Go reverse order.
Yeah, Commissioner Abdi?
Aye.
Commissioner Albrecht,
Aye.
Commissioner Roman,
Aye.
and aye for myself. Motion passes. The item of Planning Commission moves to the February 11th. Planning Commission meeting format moves to February 11th. And I believe that concludes all our items for tonight. And now we know already that we have 2 items and what they are for the February 11th meeting. So that concludes our meeting for tonight. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Whew.